happened there? All right.
Yes.
You know what to do. Escape. Never saw that happen before, but it's good to know.
So good morning, everyone. All those who are here in person and all those who are on Zoom to the Writing Effective NIH Grant Application Workshop. And just some technical issues. If you want to ask a question, who are here in the person, just press the button in front of you till it turns green and keep it pressed as you are asking question. So it will activate the mic as well as the camera on you who is asking the question. And those who are on Zoom, you know exactly how to ask the question in terms of raising your hand, or as Paul suggested, you can interrupt while he is giving a talk. But please keep your microphone mute when you are at Zoom. My name is Iqbal Ahmed, and I am a developmental neurobiologist and who is interested in stem cell regulation in the central nervous system. And the practical approach to that is regenerative medicine. Administratively, I direct the Office of Postdoctoral Education and Research at UNMC with help of Dr. Charles Clinton, who has organized this workshop in collaboration with Heather Braddock from Great Plains IDEA Clinical and Translation Project. So I would like to thank both Charles and Heather for organizing this wonderful workshop. I can tell you from my own experience of 30 years working in academia that the success of academic career depend directly on writing an effective NIH or grant applications where you literally walk the reviewers as if holding their hands through your ideas and through your experimental approaches without taxing his or her mind or time. So by the end of the application, when they reach the last page, they're as excited about your project as you are almost. I think writing an effective grant application is an art form. And who better here to tell you and guide you about it than Mr. Paul Casella. So I would like to tell a little bit about him, and I'm going to read this so that I don't make any mistake, because this is an amazing biography, if you will. Paul Casella is a Master of Fine Arts, right? So, and let me tell you, go back and tell you this next 4 hours will be one of the most important part of your training as a postdoc. Coming back, so Paul is a graduate of Dartmouth College and the Iowa Writers Workshop. He has a varied career, which included producing and directing a poetry program for Iowa Public Television. And you know, poetry is imagination and how you put your words on a piece of paper. In 2009, he joined the faculty at the Carver School of Medicine at the University of Iowa, where he works with faculty and physicians on communication skills, which includes presentation, speaking, writing, editing, grant writing. And he has given more than 3,000 seminars, would you believe? 3,000 seminars across the US and Europe, such as this one, including, beside UNMC, Albert Einstein College of Medicine, Johns Hopkins University, Harvard University, the European Association of Urology. So he has actually crossed the boundary, if you will, the National Institute of Health, the University of Nebraska, Omaha, the University of Nebraska Medical Center, where we are right now. In 2014, he co-authored and edited the institutional development application for the Clinical and Translational Research Center's idea here at UNMC, which is actually helping us organize this workshop. So with the help and support of the CRT, IDEA CRT, we are pleased to welcome Paul Casella for a grant writing workshop. And again, I kid you not, the next 4 hours will be extremely important as a part of your training. Paul.
Well, thank you very much. Dr. A set the bar very high for me, so I'm going to live up to that as much as I can. I think I should go ask for a raise first. What he said at the very beginning is one of my core themes today, and that is the more clear and direct you can write your information, the more the reviewer can concentrate on the content of your message, and the less work they have to put toward trying to figure out what you're trying to say, right? And so to even be more radical, it's like this. You want to pretend that you're writing your application so your viewer can just scrape off or copy a sentence or two and then paste it right into their reviewer critique template. And in the second hour, we'll actually look at what the reviewers are asked to consider, and we'll look how you can mine sentence starters, little phrases from those criteria, and use them to inform your writing. We're going to divide this talk into two parts. First is to talk about writing more in general and a big emphasis on the writing process. And this would apply not only to grants, but for your manuscripts to submission to journals, and really anything you would write in your professional career. We'll take a break about 9:45, 15-minute break. And then in the second part, we'll focus closely on the NIH grant application itself and the different sections there, and what you can do to improve your chances of writing a clear, lucid, and in the NIH's word, a compelling grant application. They don't ask for a convincing proposal. They don't ask for a persuasive proposal. They ask for a compelling proposal. And you can see that word has a tone of that word has an element of course, maintaining your objectivity and your credibility. So another big theme we'll talk about today is that you can sell your idea in an objective and scientific way, maintain your scientific credibility, but still frame your information so that the reviewer is interested, knows it's important, and ultimately writes a positive review. And as we heard, you're free to ask questions, interrupt me, raise your hand, type them in on the chat box in Zoom, and Charles is kindly going to interrupt me if he sees a question on Zoom. I know we have a number of people watching by that way. We're not going to workshop writing samples. If we had a whole day, we'd do that, but we'll start with those first two. So we start with how to think about grant writing. William Zinsser, an author and a thought leader in the writing process and how to write effectively and how you can use the process to improve your ultimate product. He says, writing is not only a means to share the information, but it's actually a way that you can, a tool that you can use to come up with better ideas. We'll talk a bit more of that at length. So he says, you can use writing as a tool for thinking. What we'll get into is on a practical level, and I try to be as practical as possible. This means setting aside a certain time a day, an hour a day, 2 hours a day, and focusing only on your writing at that point. Now, I know you're busy people, you got experiments to run, those experiments, you can't just let them go for 12 hours and write, you have to keep on going back to them. But if you can carve out that time, in the long run, you'll be more efficient and more effective at your writing. And then I'll talk about my friend Abraham Verghese. He's an author. He's grew up in Ethiopia of Indian parents. And if you haven't read his novel, Cutting for Stone, I suggest next time you have a week off on a beach, read this 550-page novel. It's a fantastic novel. I'll talk about him also and what I learned from him. I met him at the Writers' Workshop. My favorite quote about grant writing in particular, and I should mention this as an aside, but the strategies we're talking about today apply certainly to NIH, which we'll use as examples, but you can apply them to any other type of grant opportunity that you write for, as well as writing for submission to the journals. So my favorite quote is Thomas Jefferson. He was asked to write the Declaration of Independence. He thought about it. He decided he would do it. And in a letter to a friend, he was talking about his decision to do it. And he said he planned to put it in terms so clear and direct as to command their consent. And I think that's a brilliant quote as far as how to think about grant writing. You want to put it in such a way that the reviewer cannot help but agree with it and write a positive review. And another major theme of this grant writing topic, as well as other grants, other writing, documents you put together, submission to the journals, in addition to the talks you'll give for the rest of your academic careers and rest of your career, no matter what area you end up in, is the feature benefit model and the feature benefit proof model. And we'll go into great detail about that. I should mention, we also have a number of exercises throughout this seminar as well. Not long ones, really short ones. So good writers satisfy reader expectations. All writing is reader-based. Grant writing in particular, and writing for the journals, is what we call reviewer-based. And that means that you would write in a format that's familiar to the reviewer, the reader, so that that person can again, concentrate on the contents and not be distracted by the stylistic, differences that they're used to. And again, feature benefit model, we want to, at every reasonable opportunity, convey why your information is important and convey it in such a way that makes it interesting. So what do you like to read better in the journals? Do you like to read the text and the sentences and paragraphs? Or do you like to look at the figures? What's figures? Of course we like figures. So I'm gonna get to suggesting you put a figure or a table on every page of your grant application. Your submissions to journals, maximize, they say you can get 5 figures, put 5 figures in there. Do the maximum. And then a big thing about thinking about reviewers, either at, again, the journals or at a grant opportunity, is to consider their psychology, right? And this is the way I put it. Here's a reviewer on a study section meeting. Smart person, gone to good schools, been told he's smart. He thinks he's smart. And he's reading a proposal and it's hard for him to understand. In that situation, you have a smart person who's now feeling not smart. Is that a good thing or is that a bad thing? And that's a bad thing, because what's the mindset of that reviewer? The mindset of that reviewer then becomes, let me find another mistake in here. Let me find a reason to put that on the triage pile. Let me find to give it a reason to give it a bad score. Conversely, the smart person who understands what you're conveying, who knows where to find things in application because you've satisfied the reviewer expectations. The mindset of the one who can understand is, let me give this a good review, right? Let me find out what's good in here and emphasize that in my review. And then Leanne Ray Flair, I followed her around for a week back in the 1990s. She's got a book about 3 inches thick about writing an NIH grant application. She says in her great article called Confessions of an NIH Peer Reviewer that a happy reviewer tends to be a positive reviewer. I should mention one of the main confession that Dr. Ray Flair had in her article is that the only time when she served on a study section, the only time she had to review proposals in advance of that meeting was in the passenger seat of their car as her husband drove them to work through the streets of Boston every morning. Not an ideal time and place to concentrate on someone's state-of-the-art, cutting-edge proposal, right? So recognize that the reviewers might not be reading every single sentence, they might be skimming through it. We're going to talk about the editorial ways you can accommodate for that. We'll see more about Dr. Ray Flair's comments in that article. The links are on the slides. The slides are going to be sent to you exactly at noon today or shortly thereafter. Exactly at noon today or shortly thereafter. That's something I would edit. And so you'll have those resources. So we first talk about how writing is a process. I already talked about the quote, how Zinzer said, you can use writing as a tool for thinking. I'll go into that in greater detail. He also said, because my group in New Haven at the time had a half a day with Zinsser, put him on the train, came up to New Haven. And during that seminar, he said, if you take care of the process, the product will take care of itself. That goes back to carving out that hour a day. And now with voice recognition software, you don't have to type that stuff out. You can do it on your walk to work, dictate it into your text or an email, and you have a nice first draft, right? I should say in the year before I came to the RFAs workshop, I took a year off. I didn't get a TA, so I deferred for a year. I figured I'd give them a year to let them come to their senses, And I got a job as a paralegal on Wall Street in a bankruptcy law firm. And I had to file papers in the Southern District in Lower Manhattan, take the subway to Brooklyn, file papers in the Eastern District. And I would plan it so that I would walk back to the office over the Brooklyn Bridge. And this is 1987, 88. And I bought one of those pocket recorders at the time. And it was a whole week's salary back in 1987. It was $250. And I would walk over the Brooklyn Bridge, reciting my poetry or talking my ideas into that recording. And it's not uncommon to see people walking around talking to themselves with cell phones now, but at the time, I looked like another one of those crazy people talking to themselves in the corner. But at the end of those 6-7 months, that job, I had it transcribed. I had 2-inch thick manuscripts of my ideas in which I could mine for the best stuff. Writing is a process. We're going to talk about the free writing process and then the revision process, how you need to separate the two. In other words, if you try to write the perfect first draft the first time, you'll never get anywhere. And you need to factor in multiple iterations for revision after, for instance, getting feedback from your mentor, from your colleagues. Sometimes it's best to get a feedback from somebody who's not an expert in that area. Like me, I'm not an expert in any area of medicine because I simply can't fill in the gaps, right? And they can, even if they put a comment bubble with a question mark, you can clarify that little bit. So this is how Zinsser explains the initial stages of the writing process. He says there's 2 types of writers in the world, A writers and B writers. A writers are very rare. They do not struggle with the writing process. They've probably been reading the medical literature for decades. Comes down to sit down a paper and it pretty much comes out close to that perfect first draft because they're so familiar with it. Most of us, Zinsser says, are B writers. We have an idea, we think about it, we organize it, we make multiple outlines, and regardless, we write it out, it comes all messy, all mishmashed, all out of order. Zinsser's point is that it's okay to start out in the initial stages as the B writer. Do a little free writing, he calls it, or brainstorming. Let it come out messy, and then at a certain point, you take a step back and say, okay, how do I reorganize that so it looks like it fulfills the reader expectation? So that's okay. For writing a grant proposal, you might take a month of free writing your ideas. You know what I think would be a really fun way to write a grant proposal? I mean, I know that sounds contradictory, fun and grant proposal, but it would be, say to yourself, okay, I'm going to give myself 2 weeks and not write a single word. I'm just going to design figures because we decided we like figures most. Just write figures or to create figures. Only if maybe half of them ultimately get into your application, I would argue that all of them would help guide your writing later on when it comes to write it out. So there's the intuitive stage, that free writing stage, that brainstorming stage, which is kind of messy, which is kind of mysterious. We know how it really happens. And then there's that explaining stage, and organizing stage, the teaching stage, where you put it in that familiar format. That's 2 steps to the initial writing process. I'm going to argue for 3 steps to the overall writing process, at least, in that you have the intuitive stage, the organizing stage, and then you solicit that feedback and you revise. I took 1 computer science class in college, and I learned this little phrase. It was called a recursive subroutine, right? Recursive meaning it calls on itself. So that means you might be in the revision stage and realize you might have to go back to the intuitive stage a little bit and reorganize. So writing is a process. Writing is 10% inspiration, 90% perspiration. Again, if you go into the project, know it's going to take a number of revisions. It makes a better product in the end. So let me get asked this. What were you doing when you got your last best idea? You probably weren't sitting at your desk and ready to write it out, right? So here's some examples of what I hear over the last 25 years in my seminars. I get it when I was working out, when I was driving to work, when I was about to fall asleep, on vacation. The number one answer has been in the shower. And actually, there's an article out there. I just try to find it. Someone was thinking that it was the physical sensation of the water hitting your body that put you into that higher state to give you that insight. And in fact, on the emergency medicine circuit, there's a speaker, saw him about 20 years ago, Cornell Jepson. He said, if you get your best ideas in the shower, then you should have a set of wax pencils on the ledge there so you can grab it and write it down. Basically, the answer to this question is oftentimes you get your best ideas when you're doing something else. And so that's why with smartphones now, there's no excuse for pulling that out of your pocket, hitting that record button, and capturing that idea before you lose it. Another question I ask is, how many times in the course of your day are you busy doing something else and you get an insight into something and you say to yourself, that's pretty astute of me. I'm going to remember that and write that down later. And then what happens? You never remember it. You never write it down later. That insight is lost to the wind forever. So we want to capture these moments when we get there. As we talk more about the writing process, I'm going to talk about how, to a certain extent, don't overthink this, but to a certain extent, writing is a religious activity in that you maintain a state of preparedness by writing every day, keeping your skills sharp, so that when you do get that insight, you have the ability to capture them. So we talked about using the smartphone. I know you all have lab books where you record your data and your thoughts and everything. So in your lab book, some kind of journal, index card and pen. I go into faculty offices at Iowa, and not uncommon to see 1 or 2 whiteboards on the walls. And this is a list of the things to do. And here we have graphics and mind maps, and it's like the next grant they're working on. They're living physically in the realm of their ideas. So consider a whiteboard, or use a whiteboard if you have one nearby. Ultimately, you've got to personalize it and find your own best way. Now, grant writing is complex, more complex, say, for writing for the journals, because you're doing 2 things at once, oftentimes. The NIH asks that you write for the intelligent non-expert, right? But of course, you still have experts in that panel. So we're going to talk about ways today how you can accommodate both these person who skims through the document and the person who's like the primary, secondary reviewer who's charged with writing that early review in advance of that meeting. As Matt Rizzo, the PI of the IDEA, or Great Plains IDEA CTR, says, it's not called the National Institute of Research, it's called the National Institute of Health. So here you are proposing your research, but the main priority of this funder is to improve the health of Americans. So at the same time you're writing your science, you've got to draw the relationship to how it's going to ultimately improve health. Now, I have my main job is at the University of Iowa. I'm with the Office of Faculty Affairs and Development. I'm available to the 1,300 faculty there to edit their papers, give these talks, and coach them on their presentations. Where I'm going with that, it'll come to me later on. So 2 purposes. Oh, so I helped the speaker prepare for her talk, not more than 2-3 years ago, an implementation scientist. And I learned from her that the average amount of time it takes basic research to translate into actual therapies is 17 years. So the work you're doing, the results you're getting, could be 17 years away from actually being translated into a therapy or some kind of way to improve health. But yet you're still obligated to draw the line for how your work is going to lay the foundation to develop therapies, whatever it's going to be, ultimately to improve health. At the NIH and at many other organizations, because many private foundations model their review process after NIH. And if you don't have a set of instructions specific to that internal mechanism or that private foundation, use the NIH model, which we'll go through in detail in the second half. But there are two stages of review at NIH. So first is a scientific review. That's where the panel talks about your proposal for about 20 minutes. They give a score. If you get a score, that means it's fundable. You can get funded. But as you know, there's a cutoff line, and sometimes it's 20%, sometimes 13 percentile, and it varies. It's not like they just fund everything above the 25th percentile and don't fund everything below that. It goes to council in that second stage of review. And at council, if they see a proposal that better advances that mission, they can choose to fund one that got a worse score than one that got a better score. I don't know how often that happens, but recognizing that, that's why it's important to not only address the science, but the impact on health and the mission of that particular institute or whatever the funder is. And then, as we'll talk most in the next few minutes, you're obligated to write for the reviewer who's going to look at all the details, as well as the reviewer who's going to skim through it in 5 or 10 minutes on the airplane on the way to the review meeting. It's not uncommon. So how to think about grant writing and to accommodate that skimmer, that intellectual skimmer. Pretend the reader is only going to read the first sentence of every paragraph and nothing else. Will that person get that overall picture? And for that matter, pretend that the reviewer is only going to read the subheading, the subtitle of each paragraph and nothing else. And I'm going to say here in a half second, put a subheading on every paragraph. It doesn't have to take up a whole line of space. You can put in bold the subheading and then just start the first sentence there. You can set up the first sentence so that the topic of the first sentence is in bold, serves as a subheading and as the start of the first sentence. And then, of course, the importance of figures and tables. I advocate 1 per page. So I'd like to have manageable paragraphs I talk about, short paragraphs in a 11-point font, 5-inch, half an inch margin all around. I think you should have at least 4 separate paragraphs so you have a little white space, give the reader a break between paragraphs. A subheading in every paragraph, figure and table in every paragraph. And then on the other side of the scale is the recipe analogy. And that would be pretend that someone else is going to carry out the work, right? So write it like a recipe where you have all the details. If you have that granularity of detail, that can give the reviewer confidence that you can carry out that work. So again, difficult, you're accounting for 2 different types of readers. I promised a number of exercises. We're not going to do this one, but this could be a great thing you can do on your own this afternoon, tomorrow, and this is going to be a free writing exercise. I get this from my colleague Audrey, who took a semester-long class on grant writing at the University of Miami. And she said the professor started the course by saying, grant writing is such an emotionally burdensome event, right? It's like, oh, I got to get the grant so I can, get a job and get my career. It's really hard. And he says, let's take that emotion out of it, right? Let's switch it around. And instead, he says, let's give you the bag of money first. So here's $1 million. What are you going to do with it? You can spend the next 2 weeks just writing what you want to do with your bag of money, right? And that would be a great early first draft. So that's something you can do on your own. I found the $1 million bill on the internet about 25 years ago, 15, 20 years ago. Okay, so talking about applying yourself to your writing every day, it's called journaling. We English teachers call it journaling. And if you write a page a day every day in your log, or you dictate for half an hour in your voice recognition software file, you will be able to get insights into your ideas over time than if you didn't do that every day. And I make this case with 3 stories. That's how important I think it is. And we'll get into weather map analogy and the other 2. So I moved from New York City to Iowa City, and I get cable TV. First time I had cable TV in my life. and I kind of fell in love with the Weather Channel. It showed like a picture of the Earth from outer space, like Al Gore wanted to put a satellite up there with a picture. It was computer generated, of course. But what the Weather Channel taught me about writing was when they put the weather map in motion, they did what they called the 7-second loop. So they did a little time lapse with the radar data, right? So you can see the radar, you can see the storm front moving through, you can predict the weather. Let's pretend that you're in a spaceship looking down on North America and you see this snapshot in time. Do you get the same insight into the weather that you do in the 7-second loop? No, why not? Just because it's an instant, right? It doesn't show a lot of it. It's only after they time lapse that data can you predict the weather. I argue that the same thing is true with your professional, with your academic lives. You need some kind of tool to do a little time lapse with your thinking. And that, I argue, is your journal, your log. You write half an hour a day, dictate half an hour a day in your log. You do that for 20 or 30 or 50 days. And then you go back and you read 50 days of information in the hour or so it takes to read it. And you'll be doing the same thing like the 7-second loop. You'll be condensing 50 days of information into just an hour. And in doing so, you'll see the patterns emerge. You'll see your certain creative particular insights into the issue. And at the very least, you'll be able to identify topics of interest that you can pursue. And you know that if you work on things you're interested in, you bring more effort to it. That's the Weather Channel analogy. These are the Wright brothers. And the quick story about them that I learned from a PBS documentary is that they had that initial success in Kitty Hawk, then they go to Dad's bicycle shop, and then they're trying to make this thing fly on its own. And whenever they had a problem, they would argue about it, right? And in arguing about it, they'd come to some certain insight. And I would argue that by journaling, or if you think the discussion section of a scientific paper is kind of like debating the issue, right? And in debating it, you come to some kernel of truth. So a little story about them also applies to the journaling process. Now, I'm not going to talk about each of these, every one of these right now. You'll see a similar slide later on in the second half. But here's just an example of a number of steps you would take in the writing process. And these themes you see here on the slide, we'll talk about today. All as, again, important parts of the process. Take care of the process, the product will take care of itself. So ideally, if you could do it at a regular time of day and a place where you won't be disturbed, that'd be great. And if you can, go into the project with a positive mental framework, like pretending you have the bag of money, it might lead to being a more efficient writer. In my case, we bought a house in 1996. 1998, we had some renovation done. I'm sitting in the backyard with my buddy Brian, and we're looking at my garage, 1928 house, not a big garage. My station wagon never fit into it, 18 by 12 feet. And Brian says to me, why don't you do like Marvin Bell, one of our mentors, professor, why don't you make that to your studio? I'm like, brilliant. I threw $7,000 at the problem. I had it insulated, air conditioned, heated, and it's 40 feet outside my back door, and I can actually get outside and have peace and quiet and write. My wife, needed to get me because the kids are, burning the house down. She can open the back door and yell at me, and I can come in. So, I mean, whatever your variation of having a little private office in your backyard is, I encourage it. Prior to the IDEA CTR, Great Plains IDEA CTR grant, the other big grant I helped edit was at the University of Iowa, the Clinical Translational Center Award. So we're talking about a 330-page document, 12 different authors, each responsible for 10 or 15-page sections. And so as an editor, I'd have to go and visit with these authors and debrief them on my edits. So we have one superstar, Jeff Murray, geneticist, ultimately ended up working for Gates Foundation for many years. I don't know where he is now, but His lab is in a building called Med Labs, which was built in 1925 or something. So it looks ancient, like Frankenstein era. You're walking through the hallways, you expect to see one of these monster, like electric switches, click like this, brick. And then I get to his lab, knock on the door, and the lab assistant opens the door. And it's like walking into the future. Everything is stainless steel and gleaming, and he's just doing great work. And I say, oh, I have to talk with Jeff. I have a meeting. So he takes me back to Jeff's office in the middle of this, in the end corner of this lab. And I get to him, and there's the door, and there's a piece of that yellow police tape strung across the door. And on it, he wrote, "I'm writing a grant," right? It was like, stay away. And sometimes I come with like 50 pieces of yellow tape and I give them to everyone. Yeah. I know another department head at Iowa. This is back before cell phones. And this beeper had a secret code with his secretary. And he put himself in a supply closet, right? And unless he got the secret code from the secretary, he was just gonna work there. My buddy Abraham, I'll talk about him. I met him in the writer's workshop. His story is fairly unique. He's the guy I mentioned who, of Indian parents, grew up in Ethiopia. He was always interested in writing, but his parents were Indian. They said, you have to be a professional, doctor, lawyer, whatever, So he became a physician. He moves ultimately to US. He trains in New York, and ultimately he's in Johnson City, Tennessee, funded. He goes into infectious diseases because you can cure people, right? And then what happens? HIV epidemic happens, and the sons of Johnson City basically return from the coast to die. And he has a crisis. He got into it because he can cure people, his patients are dying on him. So he turns to writing to deal with this. He goes to the summer writing workshop at Iowa, and then he ultimately goes into the Master of Fine Arts program, a 2-year program in Iowa City. His colleagues told him he was committing professional suicide to work only a half a day a week in the AIDS clinic and do a master's degree. But because he had this profound experience before he went to the master's degree, he had met some agents and he graduated with a book contract, kind of rare. He's got a family to support, takes a job as residency director at Texas Tech El Paso, and he's got to write the book. So what does he do? He sets his alarm for 4:30 every morning. He gets up and he writes for 2 hours, 2.5 hours in the morning. Showers, goes to the hospital, rounds with the residents. And I remember him telling me this in his office in El Paso, maybe 15, 20 years ago. He says, some days somebody would say something in the course of his day that would trigger some kind of insight or some kind of answer to the question he was writing about this morning. He says he knows it wasn't divine inspiration. He knows it was because he had been sensitizing himself to the issue by writing about it in the morning. I was in the Medical College of Wisconsin giving one of my talks there, talking about this, and somebody on this side of the room about here, she goes, that's what the cognitive psychologists call the incubation of ideas, right? Or the fermentation of ideas, or whatever process you want to apply to it, it works with your ideas as well. Wrote 2 nonfiction books, and then wrote that Cutting for Stone book, which I encourage you to read. And everyone's eagerly awaiting his next Dickinsonian gigantic novel. It's been like 10 or 12 years already. So most of us are more comfortable in the spoken language than we are writing. So you can use this spoken language to inform the written language. Give a talk about a topic, set your camera or your phone to record the talk, transcribe the talk, and use that as first draft. I find my best time to write is about between 6:30 and 8:30 in the morning. I remember back when my oldest was in grammar school, I'd be out in that office at 6 a.m. even 5:30 sometimes, writing for 2 or 3 hours, walk her to school, come back, that's a nice half-hour break, do another hour or so of editing, writing. Then I couldn't stand it anymore. I just had to go for my jog. And then I would be 2 miles away in the middle of Hickory Hill Park, and that's when the perfect paragraph would gel in my head, when I was doing something else. That's when I learned to carry the pen and the pad in my pocket. Some people might, like Robert Frost, walking through the woods on a snowy evening. Frost composed poetry while he was going on a little hike, right? So maybe you can use your workout as a means to inspire you to write. Maybe you can use your workout as a reward for putting in that couple hours writing. Oftentimes, for instance, when you're submitting to journals, you're writing with co-authors. And my main advice there is upfront decide who is going to do what, by when. And now with Zoom especially, there's no reason not to have a little check-in meeting every week, every couple weeks, to make sure people are on target. Decide who's going to be first author, second author, third author, et cetera, beforehand. Decide who's responsible for making, ultimately, that manuscript have a unity of voice throughout. So, just a summary at this point, writing is a skill. Like any skill, it can be improved with practice. Certainly, we've talked about writing as a process. You got to find your own best way to attend to that process. And I mentioned writing is rewriting. We move now into how to write that compelling text. And certainly clarity, super important. Clarity and compelling are these main two topics in this subsection. To do this, we're going to look at the different structures of the different elements of your writing. So we'll take it from the sentence, go through the paragraph. In the second half, we'll look at some images about figures, and we'll look at this, again, second half, the sections of the NIH proposal itself, the formats they expect, so you can satisfy reviewer expectations. But first, let me ask, in science writing, how many ideas should your reader get from your writing? In poetry, I write a poem, it's got 10 different interpretations, great poem. But in science, how many interpretations do you want your reader to get from what you've written? Ideally, just a single interpretation. How many times do you want your reader to read that sentence or paragraph to get the single interpretation? Ideally, just once. And you know what my third question is now already. How many times do you find yourself rereading sentences and paragraphs because you just didn't get it the first time? Way too much. So our goal is to write in such a way that it forwards a single interpretation, unity of message the first time through. This, according to another one of the experts that we flew in from Duke and to New Haven, this is impossible, he says. Dr. Gopen, who's both a lawyer and a PhD, that's a dangerous combination. He says this is impossible. He says, the best you can do is by using the subtle structure, positions of emphasis in the sentence and paragraph and so on, the best you can do is forward the best interpretation that you want the reader to come away with. He says that misunderstanding in writing is 85% due to these structural issues, and only 15% due to contextual issues. And that's why we're going to focus on the structure of the different elements of your writing. So we start with the sentence. I don't ever remember being taught that each sentence should just have one idea in it, but that is the idea behind the sentence. Number one and number two edit I make for the manuscripts I edit as a freelancer in Iowa is to take sentences with 2 and 3 and 4 ideas in them and to break them out into their individual units. You can write complex ideas with relatively simple, straightforward sentences. Again, as we heard in the introduction, you want the reviewer to be able to focus on the content and not on the style. 1 idea per sentence. So now we do an exercise about the position of emphasis in the sentence. And to do this exercise, and you on Zoom can do it at home, and you here, I hope you'll do it here. I want you to give me a thumbs up or a thumbs down as to whether you agree to undergo this theoretical treatment or procedure, whatever it is. Thumbs up or thumbs down. Although the treatment is highly effective, it has significant side effects. Okay, erase your vote. So we're going to do it again with another sentence. Although the treatment has significant side effects, it is highly effective. Okay, you find yourself voting 2 different ways. Now, we're not yet talking about the subtlety yet. There is one word in those first 2 sentences editorially that is teaching you how to vote. What word is it? I mean, effective is kind of a loaded word, and side effects, of course, a loaded word, significance, loaded word, but the editorial wise, the word that's teaching you how to think about this idea is the although, right? The although is what we English teachers call a subordinator. And it says whatever's in the subordinate clause is less important than what's in the main clause. That's why in the first case, you were probably not keen on it, and the second one, you were more keen on it. To look at the subtlety, what we'll do is we'll take this word although out. And full disclosure, I got this exercise from Dr. Gopen. I changed the wording around for more science-based audience. So vote one more time. The treatment has significant side effects, but it is highly effective. No votes. 1/2 vote like this. Okay. And one person, one of my seminars said, well, the word but throws a little interpretation in there too, doesn't it? I was like, I agree. So let's make it even more difficult. The treatment is highly effective and it has significant side effects. Oh, good, I get both, right? So where you don't have a subordinator or there's some feature to help you think about it, the question is, where is the natural position of emphasis in the sentence in American English? Is it the first half of the sentence or the second half of the sentence? In American English, Gopen says it's the second half of the sentence. And that's what he calls the stress position. So allow me to organize a sentence like Gopen did for us. He says in the subject position or the topic position, it makes more sense, allows the reader to understand better if you put the old information, the backwards looking information that the reader expects. In the verb position, you put the action, and we've been taught over and over, put the action in the verb. That doesn't mean you can avoid linking verbs like is and are. And the passive voice is perfectly appropriate. It's not evil like Microsoft Word would have you think with its squiggly underline. And in the second half of the sentence, what he calls the stress position, this is the place for the more important information, the new information, the information that deserves to be stressed. Oftentimes your sentences are better if they go from broad to specific. My analogy for the sentence in the paper is that it's like a step on a hike, right? So each sentence is a step, the whole paper is the hike. You want to take a step on a hike, you have to have some footing, some familiar territory. That's the subject position. The action, of course, is firing your hamstring and kicking out your leg. That's the verb. And then the new territory you come across, where your weight comes down, that's the position of emphasis. Do you think about this when you're in the free writing brainstorming stage? No, because that's going to slow you down. This is something you think about then as you edit later for your revisions. I should mention why Gopen claims, or why Gopen makes the case why this is a stress position in American English. That is because it is the last information left with the reader. It is the moment of closure of the sentence. And he says, Americans are looking for closure. I'm making a big deal about American English. I'm going to differentiate that from British English. And I know this because I review books. I do these mini reviews. They're about 200 words long. And one of the books I had to review was from Cambridge University Press. So let's call it British English, right? The title was a little intimidating. It was How to Publish in Biosciences, 500 Tips for Success. I thought, do I need to know all 500 or would 498 do? But I had, and the other beautiful thing is they give you just an hour to go through that book before writing your review. So I'm paging through the tips, and I agreed with all of them except for one of them. And the one I disagreed with was put the most important information at the beginning of the sentence, which is contrary to what we're talking about here. So you might have learned that way. American English, the stress position, second half of the sentence. So an example. In fact, I came across this example before we had that day with Gopen. It was a grant application from the University of Illinois at Chicago, a big lightning research center, although Omaha could be one too after last night. The sentence was just, the music was off in my ear. The sentence read, as you see it, the first one, development of an animal model for lightning injury is the goal of this project. And I, as an author's editor, I thought, is that the best way to say it? Or would it be better if I turned it around, as you see in the second one? The goal of this project is to develop an animal model for lightning injury. Which one is better? The second one, clearly, right? Because every project has a goal. That's a reader expectation. And the sexy part, the animal model for lightning injury, we should put that in the natural place of emphasis. Another nice thing about this revision you see here is that development, that 4-syllable noun that starts a sentence, was revised into a verb, is to develop. So interesting, the stress position might promote more active writing. So just to remind you then, old to new, least important to most important. In other words, put the most important stuff in the second half of the sentence. We put a bunch of sentences together, what do we get? We get a paragraph. I already made one point, how the first sentence should be the most important sentence of the paragraph. And my analogy for that is a bucket. If you put as your topic sentence the most important information, it's like giving a reader a bucket, a vessel in which they can retain the information that's to follow. So if the bucket is the topic sentence, then the information that follows is analogous to the liquid in the bucket. If you gave someone a volume of liquid, your best advice is to give them some kind of vessel to carry it around in, because it's easy to carry around. And then the third part of this analogy is a handle on the bucket. And the question is, what can you give your readers that will allow them to carry around that information in that context more easily? Our teachers told us to do a summary. And that makes sense, especially if you have a longer paragraph. If you have a short paragraph that's just 3 or 4 sentences, kind of silly to repeat what you just said 2 or 3 sentences above. But oftentimes in grant applications, we have complex information and preliminary studies with lots of data. And so it makes sense that you would summarize. I suggest if you do summarize, if you do have, use the last sentence as a means to summarize, then you telegraph that it's a summary. So you say in summary, comma, da-da-da-da, or oftentimes we see taken together, these data point to the need for da-da-da-da-da. That's my first model of the paragraph. I got another model which starts to talk about our feature benefit theme next. The second model starts the same with the topic sentence, is the same for the middle sentences, but in the last sentence of the paragraph, maybe this shorter paragraph where you don't need a summary, that could be an opportunity to put the benefit of the idea, the significance or the relevance of the information. My mentor, Deborah St. James, who hired me into this career back in 1993, I listened to her for a week, giving seminars at Yale and other places. She says that reading for the most part is a passive activity, and you have no guarantee that your reader is thinking, why is this important? What am I going to do as a result of this information? A proactive writer will take that additional step and suggest that to the reviewer, the reader. And especially when it comes to grant applications, as we talked about, they need to know how it applies to health and why it's important in general. And oftentimes you can combine those first 2 models, and in the last sentence, not only will serve as a summary, but also have a benefit or a significant relevance comment. So yeah, this is where I repeat the feature benefit model. And this basically says, for every feature, for every point you want to convey, wherever appropriate, take that extra step and tell the reader why it's important, the benefit, the significance, the relevance to the readers. Let me tell you how I first learned this. It's almost unbelievable. Having been an English major and a Master of Fine Arts, I didn't learn this until I went through sales training at Miles Labs at the drug company, right? So I graduated the workshop, had 3 years teaching composition and poetry at the community college, and then I get a dream job with Miles Labs They were marketing ciprofloxacin, which is a blockbuster antibiotic. They had 1,000 reps around the country. And any one of them could offer this free seminar to the physicians that they called on, right? And so they flew us all around the country. I've been to 48 states giving these talks, all of them except Maine and Vermont. But they thought that because I was an Iowa City hippie, and they thought I needed to be groomed, right? I needed to learn how to put a jacket and a tie on every day and, be corporate. I was an Iowa City hippie, like I said, like Birkenstocks and tie-dyes and bong hits on the porch, the whole works. So I moved to New Haven. I learned how to, my dad, who's a patent attorney, was so happy I got a real job. He gave me all his handmade shirts. My mom bought me 2 suits and shoes. So it was a traumatic time in my life. But I'm in sales training, and it was interesting. I learned about supercoiling of DNA and antibiotic resistance, all these things I didn't need to know about. But one day they taught us how to sell. And this is how they did it. They put the word feature on the board. They said, you have your features, and they put an arrow to the word benefits, and you have your benefits. The features are your facts, the benefits are the value of knowing your facts. They said the whole lesson in sales is that you sell on the benefits. You sell on the benefits. People remember your facts, your features, because you've taken an extra step to tell them why it's important. And in drug rep land in 1993, it went like this, probably still is to this day. Oh, doctor, once a day dosing, that's important because it leads to better patient compliance. The whole idea is the doctor's got to write a prescription, remembers compliance is important, and thinks, oh, no, sorry. Yeah. Doctor's got to write a script, has an opportunity to write for Adalat CC, a once a day dosing drug, and then remembers, sorry, backtrack. Doctor's got to write a script, remembers that patient compliance is important, and then recalls that once a day dosing helps to promote compliance. Even though I learned it in sales training at the drug company, it completely and totally applies to your jobs as scientists and to your submissions to journals, your submissions to grant applications, the talks that you give. This feature benefit model, I know I'm harping on this, is key to being a successful grant writer. Then fast forward 20 years, we're visiting a family in California. My wife made friends with the family, and we visit them, and I'm chatting with the dad, and he writes grant proposals for the petrochemical industry in Southern California. And he told me he was taught the feature benefit proof model of framing your ideas. And this makes all the sense in the world for those of you in the sciences. You tell your facts, you tell why it's important, you give evidence to support it. One of my seminars, somebody said, oh, wouldn't it make more sense to give the fact, give the evidence, and then give the benefit? And I said, I'm fine with that, right? So long as you include the benefit, that proof. Critical to employ that strategy. So just some examples of types of benefit statements that you make. I'm not going to read them all off, but already you can see echoes of what I started about saying about how you're doing 2 things at once. You're talking about the science and talking about the effect on public health, talking about the science and how it advances the mission of the funder. I'm here to say, do your homework, read up about the NIH roadmap, especially in your particular area of science. And I'm here to say you should have a sentence in your application that says, this project is in direct line with the vision outlined in the NIH roadmap in that it does do. So some examples of what we see as feature benefit statements. Preliminary studies usually go in the significance section, and they said, study 2 gave us the experience we need to perform this type of assay and this type of cell line. They know you've got the experience. In the approach section, we plan to take this approach because. I'm here to say, use the word because liberally in your grant application. Much stronger than the word since, which has an element of time to it. You want to say since 2015, fine. Much better than comma as, because that is not as direct a link. The word because is the strongest link between the point you're making and the rationale for it. Back to Dr. Ray Flair and something else I learned from her, and that is that consistency in paragraph format allows that reader to skim the document. And she used the word intellectually skim. Intellectually skimming is reading the first sentence of the given paragraph and saying, do I need to know more? And if so, you can keep on reading. But if not, you jump down to the topic sentence in the next paragraph and go through that same process. Don't bury your important information in the middle of the paragraph. It stands a greater chance of being missed. So yeah, they can understand it more efficiently and they can understand it more easily and more deeply. Now, tone is a subtle issue also, but very important. And you can, Master of Fine Arts, you can see how tone was a big thing we looked at. It conveys your attitude, it gives you a mental picture of you, and it influences how the readers receive and understand the message and respond to the message, meaning what they write in that critique. You want to convey a thoughtful tone and a thorough tone, certainly, that you can show the details. So that's the granularity of detail, the recipe analogy. And on the other side of the coin, we have that you can also see the big picture. And you don't want to write a grant application to impress the reviewers of how much you know, because that's just going to cloud up, make it more busy compared to having an efficiency and a unity of message so that they can focus on that particular area and write a more informed critique. So it's to convey meaning. So we have an exercise here. Which one is better? You want to write, we believe that, or do you want to write, we think that? In a science proposal, which is better, believe or think? So believe is kind of like a sense of faith, right? And what is think? Think is more of like a sense of reasoning. The answer is think. We think that. But it comes even more easily in the second example. You want to write, we feel that, or do you want to write, we reason that? A reason, that's the easy one, right? Clearly gives a sense of more reasoning. You want to write, we hope to, or do you want to write, we expect to? Expect. Now, full disclosure, I had a meeting with a well-funded senior PI at Iowa, and we're talking about this because he must have had a sentence that said, we hope to. And I said, we expect is better. He's like, in truth, we're really just hoping to get 100 hits. We have no idea what's going to happen. I was like, if the reviewer has two proposals, one says we hope to, the other says we expect to, which is he going to have more confidence in? The expect to. So even better yet than expect would be, given our experience, we can expect to have 100 hits for every 100,000 assays we run, or whatever it is. And then the last one is super easy. If funded, we would da-da-da-da, or we will da-da-da-da. We will, right? You don't want to have if funded. If funded is basically telling the reviewer, you don't have to fund us if you don't want to, right? So you want to not use a conditional tense at all. No woulds at all. It's will. You are going to do this project regardless of whether you get the bag of money from NIH or whatever funder or someone else, right? You want to have a confident but realistic tone. Other ways to engage your readers, including using the first person. Mostly, you'll use the we. And even though it's you writing the proposal, what you mean by we is you and your mentor and your lab assistants and everyone. And that's generally understood to be true. Many years, the instructions for the project description on a grant said, don't use the first person. And people thought that meant that you couldn't use it anywhere in the proposal. But it's not true. You use the we, and it leads to more active constructions. Questions and examples also help engage the reader, interest the reader. When I say telling the story, it's the story of the prior research and your preliminary studies and how you decided to take this particular approach. So you want to explain your thinking in a grant application. There's this possibility to go here, this possibility this direction. We chose this direction because this one has limitations, this one has advantages. And of course, you want to show images. We talked about that, and to use a journalistic approach. You also can engage readers by varying the length of the sentences. So you have a longer sentence and you have a shorter one, and a medium length sentence. In your first sentence of the paragraph, if you really want to grab the reader, what one group calls the hook, what's a better way to grab the reader, a short sentence or a long sentence? A short sentence, right? In one presentation skills workshop with the pulmonary fellows in Iowa, one of the doctors started to talk by saying, vitamin D is the most important vitamin in the body. Oh, controversial. Let's hear more. You know? So a short sentence is a good attention grabber. So vary the length of your sentences. And then there's also the idea of chaining of sentences. So A leads to B, B leads to C, C leads to D. That also is a more logical way to help your reader understand. The transitions between sentences, between paragraphs and sentences, I think they're a little less important in sciences than, say, in the humanities, especially given that I'm suggesting put a subheading on the top of every paragraph. So I think the subheading should serve as a sufficient enough transition. So telling the story, and then journalistic conventions. What are they? Questions, examples, sidebar. A sidebar is, you know how you're reading an article in Time magazine or New York Times magazine, and the article is 5 or 6 pages, but then there's this small 1-column little article in gray on the side of it. What's more interesting, the main article or this little article? The side little article, right? So I think I call sidebars here, but what I think sidebars are like is your figures and your figure legends. Okay, the internet has exploded because we've gotten so much information. Maybe we can call our AV guy and figure it out. Okay, we're going to move on. All right, so 9:15. What I'm going to do is call a break right now. Let us fix this thing. Let's try to aim for 9:20. No, let's go on. Sorry. Thank you, Charles. Okay. Call outs are same thing. You're reading Time magazine and there's like a quote from the article that's in bigger fonts, right? It's just like one sentence, half a sentence long. Now, I've been encouraging people to write their grant applications with call outs for 25 years. And 2 years ago, I saw my first example of it. It's one of our homegrown superstars at Iowa. He, poor guy, probably listened to this talk 4 or 5 times. But sure enough, I was editing a proposal for him. And what he did in blue text that was, much bigger than the 11-point font, maybe it was, I don't know what, 15-point font, 3 or 4 times in that proposal, he had a quote from his own proposal, had a blue line on top, blue line below, and a quote inside. And of course, it was one of the most important points in that article. And it worked. Cost a little extra space, but it serves to help focus the reader on the important points. I could see a reviewer taking that quote in the call out and putting it right into the critique. Color, of course, now that you don't have to run them back and forth. Investigators have to run back and forth from the color printer to print out those 3 or 4 pages they wanted to include in there of color. But by all means, use color in your grant applications. Don't use it gratuitously, but make sure that it has a meaning. And just the general readability of text has a lot to do with how much your readers can understand. Please. Don't forget to push the button, yeah.
When you say use the colors, do you mean that use colors on the fonts and like in the grant application? So because there are, they say that use this font size and, color.
I get it. So when I say color, I mean in your figures mostly. I do see some grant writers putting their main section headings in a light blue color. not a light blue, but a medium blue color. And that just makes them stand out a little bit. What I do see some authors do of grant applications for like their aims, which appear later on in the approach section. What they do, they put their aims in bold, and then they put a little gray background on it, like the yellow highlighting, but not yellow, like a gray, subtle gray highlighting, just to make those elements stand out a little more. But no, when I say color, I mean mostly in your figures. So to make your text more readable, the NIH says the smallest margin you can have is 1/2 inch all around. And most people just hit that 1/2 inch all around thing. But if you start out with a 0.7 inch or a 0.8 inch margin, that would make it a little easier for the reviewer. And if later on you're 1/2 page over the limits, you can start moving the margins out. Between paragraphs, because you're going to have single spaced, you're probably going to use 11-point font, which is one of the 5 approved fonts at NIH. I would suggest either Arial or Georgia Antigua, it's called, but you can look it up, right? You can see. Single spacing 11-point is kind of dense, right? So you need to open up those paragraphs a little bit. If you just hit the return button twice, that will give 11-point line break, the white space 11-point size. But you can format your paragraph, structure your paragraph. So home, the paragraph, the little arrow in the corner of the paragraph thing, and then you'll get a box that says how much line break do you want after or before your paragraphs. I would start with a 9-point line break between your paragraphs. That gives a nice white space. And then later on, if you need to save space, you can try 8-point, 7-point, 6-point. I've seen grants go as low as 2-point, but that's not enough white space. 6-point, I would suggest the smallest font between the paragraphs. Very important. Also very important is left alignment. That means your text always starts on the left margin, but the right margin is a ragged right margin, right? Full alignment would make a nice straight column on each side. And in full disclosure, full alignment will allow you to cram more characters in those 6 or 12 pages research strategy. But by all means, use left alignment because the ragged right margin allows the reader to keep their place in the line more easily. You notice the textbooks, you notice New York Times, they have full alignment, but their column's only 3 inches wide or 2 inches wide. Very easy to skim down that column. Given that you're probably going to have a 7.5 inch margin, right? 8.5 inch page, 1/2 inch margins, you need some extra, the reader needs some extra help to keep their place in the line. So left alignment, super important. And then we talked about subheadings. I'm going to add that a numbering system is critical as well, because that way it allows you to refer readers to other sections in the grant proposal. For instance, your significance section, you're talking about the history behind this thing and how you're going to address that history. And then you put in parentheses, see section 3.1.4. And that would be in the approach where it shows the experiments you're going to do to solve that problem with significance. You should do that liberally, let me say once or twice per page in a grant application, as appropriate. So effective writers engage the reader by doing those things that we talked about. They tell the story, and then we're going to move into more of the strategy of modeling your writing after proven formats and the display scholarship. I'm not going to talk about these because these come verbatim from a great article from George Eves in Grants Magazine in 1984. These strategies have applied since then and since before then. But you can look at these qualifications, look at your draft, and see the extent to which your draft achieves these qualifications. So we talked about how an effective grant proposal, I didn't talk about much. I alluded to the fact that it addresses the mission of the funder. We talked about how it also has to include its how it can advance public health. It's a marketing document that you sell the idea, but you do it in an objective and credible way. Again, by that feature benefit model, wherever appropriate. Now take a step back. In your submissions to journals, you're not allowed to editorialize in the methods and results section. right? So the feature benefit model wouldn't apply to methods and results in your submission to the journal. In your introduction, sure, tell why it's important. That's an important part of the introduction. In the discussion section, of course, tell why different areas are important. In the conclusion, first and direction, of course, you draw the significance, the relevance, the benefits of your idea. But methods and results have got to be pure, hard objectivity. What you plan to do, what you found, right? In a grant proposal, however, which is mostly a method section, you are free, in fact, you're best advised to draw the benefit of your ideas at every reasonable opportunity. We talked about how it has to have to have a good idea and clear, effective communication. We talked about how it's written for both expert reviewers and the intelligent non-expert. First time I gave the 4-hour iteration of this talk was at Emory, and their instructions to authors for their internal grant was they called it a learned scholar, but not necessarily an expert in the field. Same idea. My friend Audrey, different Audrey, she taught the semester-long class at the College of Public Health at Iowa. And she's an epidemiologist. She serves on lots of different review sections. Now, she does have a particular disease state that she's most expert in, but she also serves in other study sections in areas where she's not a total expert in. She has to bring her epidemiology expertise to this other disease state. That's an example of someone who's smart, but not necessarily expert in that other disease state area. Dr. Janet Racy, head of research at the University of Washington in Seattle, and has written a chapter in our book, talks in her chapter, she says, how to think like a scientist. So this is not my area of expertise, but it makes a lot of sense, right? Ask questions, form hypotheses based on the questions, design experiments, test those hypotheses. From an editorial perspective, this means that you have to be ultra clear on how you're doing this. So in a proposal, you want to have a logical development of plans so that each aspect of the proposal relates to your aims and how you plan to achieve those aims, the methods to achieve those aims. The test of reasoning then is that each step can be justified throughout the proposal. And again, you want to use that numbering system to help the reader understand that system, that flow of reasoning. And you refer to your key aims at every appropriate place in the significance, for instance, in the innovation section. So your writing is authorized. You think about that, the word authorized. You authorize your writing by doing the work of an author. Authorize. The work of an author is to make sure that the logic is sound throughout the document, that the reader can trace up and down, backwards and forwards, the lines of thinking, that you've accounted for the development of those ideas. You've certainly traced the background to justify pursuing those methods. And you've taken that extra step to show how that project is going to advance understanding in the field, whatever field it is. So at Iowa, there's 26 departments there, and I edit papers for all of them. I don't pretend to give scientific feedback. I just give reasoning feedback, editorial feedback. But it's interesting to me, just knowing about the structure expectations of a given journal or a grant application, I can point out where one of these lines of reasoning, where there's a gap in that line of reasoning. That's something that needs to be improved, and I identify that for them. So the key concepts will kind of come into a close here at this point in this first half. Consistency of format. In other words, the topic sentence at the top of every paragraph. Linking the lines of reasoning, using the position of emphasis in the sentence, which, as you remember, is the second half of the sentence, in the paragraph, which is the top of the paragraph, but also the last sentence where you tell the summary of why it's important. Certainly, I've talked on the feature benefit proof model. It's not going away. It's staying. It's going to reappear later. And grant writing is different also from writing to the journals in that there's a lot more repetition of information. Repetition of information is okay in a grant proposal. I have a slide later that talks about your aims. Your aims are going to appear in the project description, which is the 30-line abstract that you copy and paste into a box. They're going to appear verbatim then exactly in the proposal in the aims themselves. And they're going to appear again verbatim in the approach, like the methods place. Most people are going to organize their methods around their aims. So reinforcing repeating of important information. Other sentences like some of these benefit statements will appear on your aims page as well as the project description. So not only repeating, but weaving of information. The aims page is called specific aims, but the aims page is going to have elements of all the sections of the proposal. It's going to have a little bit of significance in it, a little bit of innovation statement about it, and it's going to give a taste of what you plan to do to carry out those aims. So a little bit of the approach section. And then, as I mentioned a few times, graphics are super important. I don't know if it was on the slide earlier, but my buddy Chuck, my neighbor 2 houses away, he's a cell biologist. And we were on the front lawn talking about this all before his first R01 was awarded. And he says that you want the reviewer to feel smart. So he was the one who gave me that idea about smart. You want the reviewer, like if they only look at the figures and tables to understand what's going on. Makes them feel smart, makes them write a better critique. Of course, we made a point that it's reader-based, reviewer-based, and you state your information clearly and directly. You don't know if it's as clear as it can be until you get feedback from your colleague and your mentor, and maybe your colleague outside of your area of specialization. Talking about areas of specialization, I got to take a quick aside and repeat what a department chair said to us in the review committee meeting about 3 years ago. He says, oh yeah, specializing, that's a kind of a double-edged sword. What happens is you learn more and more about a certain topic, and you know more and more about it until you know everything about nothing. So it's you want to be inclusive in that you want to address that expert in the review panel as well as that non-expert. So we make our writing by writing simple, direct, and explicit sentences. We're going to talk later about following instructions and how you should follow instructions to the letter just to allow the reviewer to understand. And you do that through consistency in paragraphs and the headings and numbering system. Another major theme of this talk is deconstructing and modeling. Deconstructing, taking apart, means look at sample grant application. There's one link at the NIH, but everyone can see those. So I'm here to say, bug your mentor to see a copy of funded proposal. Later on, we'll talk about NIH report. Have you heard of NIH report? This is the database of everything that's been funded, the database of those project descriptions. So you can go to the NIH report, just Google that, go to that huge query form. All you really need to put the author in. So you put your mentor's name in, first and last name. You can see the project description of the projects that got funded. Or you can put in your certain areas of focus and see all the projects that are currently funded by NIH. And you can use that project description and you can deconstruct that and let it inform your project description, your abstract. So to deconstruct a piece of writing, and you can do this, for instance, I was talking to one participant earlier, saying he's more at the stage of writing for the journals now. What I tell the faculty at Iowa, I say, you want me to do a good job? Not only send me your manuscript, but send me a PDF of a paper that's appeared in the last 3 years in your target journal. What I do, I put one up on one screen, the manuscript on the other screen, and I look at the format of the manuscript compared to the editorial approved, peer reviewed, published paper. And I just make sure that the format fits what the reviewers and editors are used to reading, how they're used to the format. In one super simple case, I noticed that the example that had been published in the discussion section, it had divided the discussion section into 3 subsections. And in the manuscript, it was just a discussion section, 5 or 7 paragraphs. So that was a simple edit. I just took the exact same headings, subheadings from the discussion section there. I found the appropriate place in the manuscript. I put them in there. You can deconstruct an article on the paragraph level. And this just means you look at the paragraph, you make an outline, 1 entry per paragraph that identifies the purpose of each of those paragraphs. Then you come away with a 25 to 30 entry outline, and then you fit your information into that format. And as we'll do in an exercise toward the end, is you can deconstruct a project description for that matter on the sentence level. Same idea. You identify the purpose behind each sentence, and then you fit your information to serve each of those purposes. So again, writing is a process overall. Here we just see a summary of what we've talked about so far this morning. I made all these points. Just want to reiterate them. And again, you're going to get this slide set. Looks like we're not a math major, but 12 minutes ahead of time. So what we're going to do is ask if you have any questions. I'm getting paid for these 4 hours no matter what, so. Okay, if you do have any questions, write them out. Those of you on Zoom, use the chat box. Charles is monitoring it. He'll repeat the question out. And so we'll take our break now, 9:34. We'll meet at 9:50 and start up again. Okay, all right, great.
Hey,
Yep.
hi, and this is actually a technical question. I wanted to get a copy of the video version of this presentation so I could keep referring to a couple parts of it. And how would I do that? Are they going to send out a link or?
Charles, you want to answer that question by pushing the button?
By pushing the button?
It is being recorded by Idea Center. I'm not sure how exactly that'll be distributed and what they're going to do with that. But Idea Center does have a copy of it that they will maintain.
Okay, so I have to reach out to them maybe, or I've never actually reached out to Idea Center, so.
Hopefully I'll have a little bit more clarity here in the next couple of days. And I can send some further instructions on that.
Okay, I'll follow up with you then in a few days if I haven't heard. Thank you.
Hi, Daniel. This is Heather from the Idea CTR.
Okay.
We are recording it, but it's only for the Great Plains CTR purposes. So I'm sorry we aren't able to share that. But Mr. Casella has agreed to share the slides, which I'm happy to send out.
Okay. Thank you.
I think we'll try to work more on that and see if we can't get the video accessible through your password protected program as well. And we'll have a whole 11 months to look at that. So we'll work on that.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Okay.
Really quickly before we get started again, too, I've been working on our website in the career development tab. I've been building a section on other sources of funding. Which mainly means I'm going to really big schools and copying what they have. And putting it on our own website, taking their sources that they posted. We have everything from NIH grants up there to programs for minority women in developing world countries. I mean, there's all kinds of different funding sources. And so, you know, after you leave here, I would recommend going to the career development website or tab on our website, and kind of looking at some of these options that are out there. This is the project that will never be done. I'll keep putting things up there as I find them. But I really hope that this is something that will be a resource for you guys where you can put this information to direct use as well. So.
Okay, thanks, Charles. Great, we're back. Okay. Now we dig into the specific sections of NIH proposal and other strategies, other resources that you can take advantage of. And just to echo what Charles says, there's a world of resources out there, not just available through that, but through, you know, Google. You know, you just search grant writing video, and you can probably get a lot of other publicly available seminars and copies of slides. I remember I gave my talk at University of Kansas, 10 years ago. Then 10 years later, so what I wanted to find exactly the article that had the quote from Thomas Jefferson about terms so clear and direct as to command their consent. So I searched the whole internet, and the only thing I could find is my handout that had that. So, I mean, I can't really can't say, I mean, I heard it from somewhere, but we're just going to call that, Thomas Jefferson. And if it wasn't him, then he get extra credit. Okay, so we now get, again, structures in an NIH grant application. We'll look at the overall format first, and then we'll go through the different sections of it. As I mentioned at the start, we'll look at the reviewer criteria, and you can use that to inform what to include. This happened once because a junior faculty member at Iowa didn't know what to put in the innovation section. And I mean, except for how is it original, how is it innovative? So I did a little digging at nih.gov, another great resource. And I came across it, right? And so there's a link to that. But that strategy of searching, digging deeper into beyond just the instructions at other like private foundations, for instance, you can also find other criteria and apply that same strategy for other opportunities. So I'm going to stress this deconstructing issue, and we're going to do an exercise on it toward the end. But Dr. Ahmad wanted me to stress to you that while that is a good strategy, you want to make sure that you don't end up plagiarizing someone. So when I say deconstruct, I don't say use the actual topic of the sentence. What I say is figure out what the purpose of the sentence is. As we're going through an exercise, is it about health? Is it about the specific aims? Whatever it is. And then you put in your own information. This is a cultural thing. My brother David does a lot of work internationally. And he tells me, as far as plagiarism goes, that in some countries, if you don't boldly plagiarize your mentor, you're not going to pass and get your degree. You know what I mean? So the trick there is cite your sources, right? You can say anything you want that anyone else said, so long as you have that citation there and give credit to it, it is valid. Further, it gives added emphasis behind that statement because it shows that it's appeared in a peer-reviewed, editorial approved forum beforehand. So cite your sources is the main key behind that. We'll deconstruct instructions so that you can feed back the information in the order they ask it, satisfy reviewer expectations, and we'll again look at some examples of figures and tables. One that I made up, kind of like the pyramids, probably 100 different English teachers made up that same little figure. So you can, in a sense, deconstruct other figures. I look up articles online and I go through them, and under the figure, there's a little box that says, download this figure. they're inviting you to download, but and if you give proper citation, it's something you can use. Or you can model your own figure based on that. So don't have to reinvent the wheel every time. That's up to the poets and the fiction writers, right? This is following the model and replacing your unique ideas with the other content in that format, in that style. Okay, so as far as the narrative of the grant applications, stuff I'm interested in, the sentences and paragraphs. This is how I see the structure of NIH grant application. There are budgets and there are other forms and things. I have nothing to do with them. I'm not going to talk about that. I'm talking about the narrative, the writing part. I talked already about that 30-line project description. When you copy and paste that into that box, anything beyond 30 lines just disappears into the void, right? It gets truncated right there. Any bold and italics you use disappears. The only thing that is maintained when you copy and paste in that box is if you want to put something in all capitals. So maybe you want to organize it like in a structured abstract with some all capitals. That'll be maintained. And you see some suggested page limits. So we know you get 30 lines for the project description. You know you get exactly 1 page, no more for the specific aims. You'd be foolish not to use up that whole page. That whole page essentially stands as a mini grant application for the whole thing that follows. I mentioned before, there's going to be elements of all those other topics in there. And then what they call the research strategy is probably going to be 6 pages for your first grant application. And for more elaborate ones, it goes up to 12 pages. So it's going to have a 6 to 12 page limit. And of those 6 to 12 pages, you see my suggested amount of pages for each of those 3 elements of the research strategy: significance, innovation, and approach. Significance, which includes some preliminary studies, I suggest 1 to 3 pages on that. Innovation, I think about half a page is about as much as you can get in there. Maybe it's so innovative you need a whole page, but the bulk of research strategy is going to be the approach section, which is your methods section. In 2009, NIH changed its terminology. So the research strategy, or the approach, the methods basically used to be called the experimental plan. The significance used to be called the background and significance. In 2009, NIH said, we don't want background anymore, just significance. How do you write something without any content base? So you're going to have to include some background information, but the key here is that you're going to frame it as far as how it's significant. What else changed? The page limits changed. You used to get 25 pages for this whole thing. Now they smushed it down to 7 or 13 pages, right? And the terminology changed a little bit in that those 5 criteria by which they judge applications, which we'll look at here in a minute, the criteria stayed the same, but the word innovation, which was usually listed as number 5, that got bumped up to number 3. So 2009, NIH said we're going to put more emphasis on the innovative aspect of grant applications. And then in 2009, NIH decided that their favorite word was impact, because those 5 main criteria are tallied to give an overall impact score. And this is why I say that your little summary paragraph of your specific aims, you subtitle impact, doing the work of the reviewer as much as possible. This is not a perfect diagram. I did it on Word or on PowerPoint, but this is how I see editorially the flow of information in an NIH grant application. And the idea is, based on your broad long-term goal, this is like the goal of your career, right? Which you establish, not your career. Well, it might be a career development award, right? In which case, by all means, do the whole 5-page section, I think, 5-6 page section on career development plan. It's in the handout, I think a whole page on that with the instructions there. And the idea is you follow them to the T. You include figures and tables, your training plan, figures, tables, make your figures colorful. Based on your broad long-term goal, you have the objective of the proposal. In fact, I need to improve this because I really need to say the objective of the project. Full disclosure, a lot of this information is based on things that I've read and seminars I've gone through, including the Morrison networks, they were called. The other most recent iteration of it is called Writing Winning Grant Applications. Very awkward title, but an excellent seminar. It's a day-long seminar. And the last time I attended it in October of 2019, the speaker, who is a real scientist, not just an English teacher here, he spent the first 3 hours purely on what I spent 15, 20 minutes on earlier this morning, which was carving out half a day, being super serious about, applying yourself to the process. So I think about this because in the Morrison networks, which have influenced decades of scientists, they've given a pretty clear model. I can basically tell if an Ames page has been Morrisonized in about 3 seconds, right? Just because I see the model. It's a good model. It helps people think through it. My boss, the Associate Dean of Faculty Affairs and Development, is a real scientist, sit on the study section. He sees that model, he's like, nah, not crazy about it. It seems like, filling in a form. But it's a great starting point. There's another resource, I've got a link on the slide to biosciencewriters.com, and you can Google it if you want to now. Their page called The Anatomy of a Specific Ames page is an ultra prescriptive, color-coded recipe for how to put together an Ames page. It's a lot more complex than the Morrison ones. I like the Morrison one because it's more explicit, easier to understand. But if you can aim for somewhere in between the Morrison format and the Anatomy of Ames format, that's my best advice at this point. So based on your broad long-term goal, you have objective of this project. That's the project you propose for the 3-year, 5-year, 1-year period of the grant, right? And to achieve the objective of that project, you design aims. You can have 2 of them, you can have 3 of them, you can have 4 of them, but those are the aims that, when achieved together, will achieve the objective of the project. Then it drops into the significance. So basically a literature review, but only the essential background you need, mostly framed as significance. We talk about innovation, why it's innovative. And then the body of the application, the bulk of it, I should make this shape a little bigger here, the approach, the methods. So the grant application is mostly methods, but you do have to sell the idea. And even in the methods, and even in the approach, you draw the benefit statements to why you chose that particular approach. Show the readers your reasoning. A little graphic way to think about it. I don't know if it helps that much. Now, here's those criteria I mentioned earlier on. Significance, investigators, innovation, approach, the environment. There's a significance section. There's the innovation section and an approach section, as we just saw about. There is a resources and environment page, which they can evaluate for the extent to which the environment is appropriate and best suited for the project. And there is a biosketch that you would include, and not only yours, but your mentors and a lot of people. So they can look at that to judge the strength of the investigators. Regardless, you're going to talk about, in a sentence or two, at some point, maybe in the Ames page, maybe significance of why the investigators are best suited to carry out that work. And then, even though there's a resources and environment section, those page limits, you can get a lot of what we call boilerplate, information that's probably on the website there or UNMC's website about the environment and just the general environment. In clinical medicine, this patient population of the area. But regardless of that resources and environment section, you still are going to have a sentence or two about how the environment is well suited to carry out that work in the research strategy. or in the aims page. And as I mentioned, these 5 areas each get a score, and those are tallied to give an overall impact score. And again, if you get scored, it's fundable. You might not get scored. That means it's not fundable, but you get a little feedback. You get scored and not funded, that means it's fundable, but not getting funded, and you get much more elaborate feedback. You should go into this effort not expecting to get funded the first try. It's very rare people get funded the first time through. Same as with the journal article. Actually, so Monday I had one-on-one consultations with people, faculty at here and at UNO, and we were talking about, see how to frame this right. Oh, so you should go into it expecting, hoping to get a score, that'd be great, and feedback on it. And of course, you're going to use that feedback to revise your application and get 1 extra page, tell how you revised it. And what I'm leading up to is this story. We're all supportive of getting to this story. So what's the job of reviewers? Their job is to review. Their job is to point out ways things can be improved. That's their job. That's what they do, right? So there's this theory of thought. It's not that you're going to especially leave a little mistake in there for them to critique, right? But to realize that's part of the process, right? You get some feedback, you revise. The story I'm leading up to is in the same vein, but about 10 years ago, we put an addition onto the house. And I've got a very astute builder and very expensive and did a really great job. Beautiful job. And of course, the city's got to come and inspect it. And the day before the city comes, he and I are looking at the job he did, and it's perfect, except there's like this 10 square feet of siding on the outside of it. That's not perfect. It's still not finished or painted or whatever it was. And I'm like, hey, the inspectors are coming tomorrow. What about this bit? He's like, oh no, man, we want to leave something for them to find because that's their job. Their job is to inspect. He's like, we make it perfect. They will find something. 2 years ago, I had a guy, we made it perfect, and they found like $8,000 of electrical work needs to be done, right? So it's like, oh, don't worry, they'll come, they'll inspect it, they'll say, oh, it's approved except for this 10 square feet of siding. And so you're going to get rejected. And then when you get rejected, they'll just say, oh, and we'll come and re-inspect when it's done. You don't have to be there. We'll just come around the backyard and look. So the idea is that, that's what happened, right? Got failed, and then approved like a week later. So don't be disappointed when you get, quote, rejected, or when you don't get funded, or when your manuscript submission doesn't get published the first try. Years ago, I was at Scott and White Hospital outside in Temple, Texas, a little north of Austin, giving my talk on writing for publication. One of the faculty there said, years ago when I was a young faculty, I submitted my first paper and it didn't get accepted. And the comments about the paper were literally longer than the paper itself. Right? He's like, oh, I did such a bad job, And I took it to my boss, said, look, boss, look at the awful job he did. And his boss said, are you kidding? This is great. Start retyping, So recognize it's part of the process. The other point is, if that manuscript for submission to the journal is sitting in your computer and not submitted, well, I guarantee you there's absolutely no way it's going to get published then, right? So I was talking with one of the faculty Monday about, he's like, I'm a kind of a perfectionist. I can always never leave it alone. Always got to improve it. But at a certain point, you got to get it out there and recognize that review and revision is part of the process. It's an inherent part of the process. Okay, so back to grant applications. We'll start with a little quick exercise. What I want you to do, I'll give you exactly 1 minute, is to write the title of your grant application. If you don't have a specific project, make one up. Okay, it's about a minute now. Now I want you to look what you've written. In my experience, I ask people to write a title and they basically write a big topic, a big noun. So I want you to look what you've written, and if it is just a big noun, then I want you to revise that title so that it includes a benefit statement. So this is really an exercise on even including a benefit statement in the smallest element of writing in your project, the title. If your title said Project X originally, then your revision will say Project X to improve health or whatever it is, right? To develop therapies, to lay the groundwork for development of therapies. Not enough time to go in and get people to call out. If we had a day and a half, we'd do that. But the idea is that even in the title, you're hitting on the benefit. Similarly, when people write figure legends, they basically write what it is. And I'm here to suggest to add an extra sentence to your figure legends to say not only what it is, but why is it important, the benefit statement. Awesome book that I encourage you to look at. It's not in my resources, so you have to remember this, type it in. It's called How to Write and Publish Papers in the Medical Sciences by Edward Huth. And in that book, Huth has what he calls the so what test and the who cares test. Nice, simple way to say, emphasize the benefit. Okay, moving on. Now we look at, go on, please.
So for the title, you have to think about future too. So if you are too specific with your grant title, you have to think about if that funded grant you want to move forward beyond 5 years, you want to have a generalized kind of title that can be carried over, so that your idea is not just, cornered for that specific grant.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Thank you for that comment. I would also say other things I've heard in that vein about titles is if you have like a controversial topic, I guess now we could pretty much acknowledge that the woman's right to choose a controversial topic. And that title is like too specific about the controversial topic. A senator might say, nix that, not getting funded, so thank you. Think about the future. Don't make it so broad that it's vague and they're not interested in it, but don't make it so specific that I don't think you're going to be tracked into one area just because you wrote one title, one grant application. You could always write another grant application, but I get your point. Thank you. Okay, now we look at the project description, right? That's the second test of the first impression of the proposal. We get the title, we get the project description, and it does set the tone for the rest of the proposal. That's probably the thing that all the reviewers read in advance of the study section meeting, even the ones that are not primary, secondary reviewers. Here are the instructions for the project description. And the idea is we're going to feed your information back in the same order that they ask for it. You're probably doing this already. You're postdocs, you've applied, you've accepted to things before. But my job in starting to deconstruct a set of instructions is first to make an outline of those instructions. And here's an outline of those instructions. And then you just fill in the blanks as far as your information is concerned. We have another exercise in the project description. So you saw the instructions start with by saying, state the application's broad long-term objectives. This is an exercise that falls under the category of my anti-creativity and scientific writing crusade. If the instructions say, state the broad long-term objectives, how do you start the first half of your first sentence, your project description? Exactly, the broad long-term objectives of this project are, right? So the novelty is going to come. Notice, this is very important. The novelty is going to come in the second half of the sentence. The first half of the sentence is going to be what they want, and the novelty comes in the second half of the sentence. That is fully in line with what we talked about as far as the stress position of the sentence. Again, that's a lesson you can apply to any time you have to follow any instruction. Just an example, here's guidelines for K awards, so career development kind of awards, right? If I'm not mistaken. What I've done is put in yellow highlighting the elements of these guidelines for reviewers that, to me as an applicant, are especially meaningful as far as what to include in my proposal. Anytime you have a funding opportunity, look at the instructions for your authors, applicants, and then if available, look at the instructions for the reviewers as well, and use that to inform your writing. This is the main theme of the second half. We can look at the overall format of the proposal in a series of questions here. The specific aims are what do you intend to do, but also a taste of all the other elements. Significance, why it's important, why does it advance knowledge in the field? What have you done already? So, I mean, you could just use these instructions as a nice guide for your initial drafts. Innovation, why is it innovative and original? And approach, what do you intend to do? Even though there's one sentence under approach, again, that's the biggest section of the proposal. There was a study done by Janet Kuka, I think it's in the 1990s, that found that of all the reasons that NIH review panels found proposals were not worthy of a fundable score, 2/3 of the time it was because of deficiencies in the methods. It was called the experimental plan back then, right? But in the approach. So that's what reviewers are mostly doing. They're looking at the methods. Doesn't mean that the other sections are not also very important. And just an example of when, say, you're applying to a private foundation or another foundation, what you'll notice is that oftentimes their instructions, their formats map pretty closely to the NIH model. And when you don't have a required format to follow, I encourage you to follow the NIH model. So the next main narrative component is the aims page. And I've said it before, you've heard it before, the aims page is super important as far as standing in as a larger abstract beyond the project description for the whole proposal. We're gonna have elements of all the different sections in that aims page. I mentioned earlier today that those aims are gonna appear verbatim in different places, a number of times. So if you tweak the aims in your specific aims page, make sure that the other ones are consistent with that as well. So they're gonna be in the research strategy for sure, in the approach, and they're gonna be in the project description for sure, because they asked for it, but they might also be referenced in other sections. So you're going to number those aims clearly. And Dr. Racy talked about her before. She said they're called specific aims for a reason. And the reason is they should be specific. And I think of specific, I think of measurable, and they should have a clear direction. So how do you make your aims specific and measurable? They are either the specificness or the measurability of this, the details are going to be embedded in the text of the aim itself, or I see authors doing it two other ways. They have the aim, and then they have the word approach, and they have one or two lines of the taste of the approach, what they plan to do to achieve that aim. The other way I see it, and that this is the way that I'll show you the model later on, is that it has the aim, and then lists the hypotheses that they plan to investigate to achieve that aim. And together those aims achieve the project description and the project objective. And that project objective ultimately advances the broad long-term goal. In the bioscience writers anatomy of specific aims page, they call the clear outcome, they call the payoff. Right, so you might also convey the specificness of the aim by including payoff, say what the result would be, the expected outcome would be. So the general line of reasoning in the Ames page, and like we did with the paragraph, we give two models for the Ames page. They're pretty similar. Is you identify in the background at the beginning, the gap in the knowledge. And often that is what is known, what is not known. There's a gap and there's a critical need to fill that gap. That's ultra prescriptive in the anatomy of super Ames page and in the following slides. And then again, as I showed in my diagram, it would mention again the broad long-term goal, mention the objective of the project. I apologize, objective of the application is not exactly precise. The objective of the application is to get the bag of money, right? The objective of the project is what you're going to work on. Okay. People often in these early paragraphs use the term central hypothesis. This comes from the Morrison networks, and it's a good idea because the word central hypothesis differentiates it from the sub-hypotheses you have under each aim. Okay. They have the aims, and then they have a statement of how your outcomes, your impact, and ultimately how your outcomes will fill the gap identified up at the top of the page. That's the general idea. And that's how I first heard it in the Morrison networks probably 25 years ago. And also it helps to have a few sentences about how that work will advance the mission of the Institute, will affect public health, is in line with the NIH roadmap. So here's my first model. In the first paragraph, you have an arresting opening. And its relevance to health, because again, it's the National Institute of Health, not the National Institute of Research. You tell the background that supports that long-term goal. What is known, what is not known, the gap in the knowledge, the importance of filling the gap, and in the Morrison networks, they use the words critical need to fill this gap. In the second paragraph, we go down a stage, again, going from my diagram earlier, the objective of the project, and then only the background necessary to support pursuing that project objective, the central hypothesis, the rationale for that. And if it applies, it's perfectly appropriate to have a sentence on why your group or you or your lab is especially well suited to carry out that work. Certainly, if you've had a publication that's been, pretty important publication, you should say, as we found, and then cite it and have the reference to your publication. Now we're at the second half of the page, the middle of the page, my first model, and that's where the aims come in themselves. Most people have 3, some have 2, some have 4. It was a 1 or 2 year period. I was editing proposals from Harvard, and it seemed to be the 4th aim was going to be to upload this data to a publicly available database that investigators can use for years to come, decades to come, to work on it. And so, I don't know if that applies. Seemed like a good idea to me. And then at the end, you have that impact paragraph, where again, you say the expected outcomes. The phrase that echoes in my head is successful completion of this project will result in maybe a statement about innovation. Certainly want to mention it's how it will advance health, maybe satisfy the mission or be in support of the mission of the Institute, and other benefit statements. And in my model, I propose a figure, not new stuff, but a figure that just graphically repeats what is in text already. And I'll show you it in, half an hour. It'll be a few arrows all pointing to the same direction. Each arrow is an aim, and the middle is the objective of the project. Now, little warning. I understand that if you submit your proposal to NIH with a graphic on the aims page, you'll get a caution, like a yellow light. Doesn't mean it's getting kicked out, not a red light, but a yellow light. And that is no graphics on the aims page. That's what the writing winning grant applications guy said in October of 2019. Now, I thought I was kind of original coming up with the idea of a graphic on the aims page. I was given the seminar somewhere during the break. someone came up to me and said, oh, nice idea, the graphical names page, but my mentor, she's been doing that for decades, right? The guy in October of 2019, when I asked, should you have a graphical names page? He said no. And I think it's because a lot of times people try to do too much in that graphic, right? It gets too confusing. And certainly if anything is confusing, you want to revise it so it's not confusing. So there's the controversy out there. That's how controversial my life gets. If you're not going to put the graphical names page, then I say, by all means, graphic on the top right of the first page of the significance, right? The top of the very next page. And we'll look at some others again in a minute here. So that's the first model. The second model, this is just a repetition of what you can see at the Anatomy of Specific Aims page. I think it's a great resource, although I think it's a little more confusing than it has to be. So I'm going to suggest you aim for somewhere between my model and their model. But it starts basically the same thing: resting opening, known information, what's not known, gap in knowledge, critical need. That, I said that twice now already. Second paragraph, they call the solution, and you say what your research goal is, the objective. So already we've talked about this a lot. And then the rationale, the central hypothesis, and what they call the payoff. Kind of similar to my model. And there's the link to the biosciencewriters.com. Again, you can just find it by searching. Pretty much everyone with a computer here and smartphone, search Anatomy of Specific Aims page and leave that page open. The third paragraph is the aims, and the fourth paragraph, they call it the summary. I think summary is a nice word, not nearly as good as impacts. So why am I so big on the word impact? Because the NIH calls it the impact score. And I mentioned Marvin Bell, our mentor. He said, poets think like thieves, right? I'm just using their terminology. He's speaking my language, right? People like people who speak like them. They understand them better. When I first read an RFA, request for application, this was prior to 2019, it was probably 1990 something. To me, it read a lot like a background and significance section. And I'm thinking, why not just copy this and paste it right into the background and significance? Poets think like thieves, right? So point is, you can use an RFA, even if you're not submitting to that RFA. Maybe you're submitting just to a general investigator-initiated proposal. Even that has a parent RFA, but you can deconstruct an RFA and use that as a model for your significance section. So again, go to that link, open it up, notice the color-coded and how I think it helps people think about it. So then comes the research strategy. And as you know, it's divided into significance, innovation, and approach, mostly approach. We'll go through these areas. The significance section is very important, of course. It sets the stage by which your work is going to be displayed, and it identifies, again, the gaps your project will fill in greater detail than you did in the sentence in the earlier page. And unanswered question your project will answer. And it's the area where you do basically the literature search or the literature review. What would you rather read? 5 or 6 paragraphs of a literature review? Would you like to see a table with one column, the year and the date of the publication, and the other column, the main finding? I think the table, and so here's what you can do with tables. Tables you can put in a smaller font. You can make a table all text. You can, the guideline for the tables is just that it has to be legible. Having said that, I've got like trifocals on up here, right? So don't go lower than 9-point font in your tables, but you can do that. And even better would be to have a graphical representation of the existing knowledge and how your work will add on to that existing knowledge. Let me give you an analogy here that might help. And that is the analogy of a jigsaw puzzle. And this I heard from Bill Blattner, who I drove across town and went to the Yale AIDS series in 1994. They have speakers from all over, and he came up from DC area, and he talked about how the discussion section in your submission to a journal, your report of original research, is kind of like, now let me back up. The body of scientific knowledge is like a jigsaw puzzle that grows from the inside out. You submit your paper, you get it published. It's like adding a piece of that puzzle. And you know, like a jigsaw puzzle, the new piece has got to fit the nooks and crannies of the old piece. And it also shows where the next piece is going to be added on to, how the next piece of knowledge is going to grow into that puzzle. And I use that example, that analogy, as a means to describe the role of the discussion section in your report of original research. In other words, you're making a case, you're tracing the literature and making a case for how your work contributes and builds the body of general knowledge in the area. I think the same strategy applies to your significance section. And I think it would be great if you could design a figure, right? Some kind of conceptual model that shows the work that's been done and how your work is going to be that puzzle piece that adds to that work or links these other areas of work that fills the gap, right? How your work is going to fill the gap in knowledge. Just some examples of areas of significance to address. Of course, it's all dependent on your work, your reading of the literature, and your awareness of the mission of the funder. Dr. Racy talks about the 4 C's of the relevant literature. So just a strategy on how to present literature review and make the case for how it advances your work. She says you compare and contrast the work done by others and evaluate it. You cite the literature judiciously, and you critique what you've read respectfully. There's a big emphasis in the last, I'm going to call it 5 or 8 years on, you've probably heard of this, rigor and reproducibility. Okay, there's a link in my slide. You should go and look at the graphic that link leads to, and it talks about the 4 different types of rigor, scientific rigor, you're going to bring to your proposal. One is the rigor of the previous research that you use to support how your work will add to it. Another is the scientific rigor of your work that you propose. Another one has to do with invertebrates or things like this, something scientific, but you can look at it, make sure that your proposal satisfies those qualifications of rigorous research. And I think about that because it says critique what you've read and respect. So we look at the format of the significance section. Again, it's going to be probably about 2 pages long, maybe a little bit longer if you have preliminary studies. I suggest you divide it into 3 or 5 main areas. If it fits, you might divide it into the 3 aims your project's going to take. I rarely see that exactly, but it includes that relevant literature and it can include preliminary studies. If you're applying to a mechanism that does not require significant studies, but allows them, do you include them? Absolutely, 100% yes. Of course, you want to use a figure, and I've got a slide later that talks about types of figures that are most conducive to different sections. And again, how it's going to make a case, how your work is going to fill the body of knowledge, add to the field, and any other benefit statements. Significance section, because it's called significance, is all about benefit statements or the facts that lead to those benefit statements. Both. If you include preliminary data, it can show that you have the ability to carry out that work, which is good. It can show how your hypotheses are supported by previous rigorously pursued work. But Dr. Racy brings up some warnings, and that is that sloppy data suggests sloppy work. So if it's not really sharp, don't include it. And if it's unclear, that also is going to bias the reviewer before they get to the approach. So you can include, mostly you want to conclude the work you've done, but if other work is really closely related, you can certainly mention that, cite that as well. Use the headings numbering system. Make sure you refer to your reader to the section which this significance applies to in the approach. And I mentioned using graphs. And interesting, if you not interesting. If you include summary sections in these 3 or 5 different areas, I mean, when I say summary, I mean 1 or 2 lines of text under each of these 3 main areas of significance, then that would help the reviewers get a concept of the whole. So if you can organize the preliminary data around the aims, use figures, and whatever it is, have some logical format if possible. So headings would be enough, but if you go broad to specific, that'd be nice, chronological. If it lacks any other type of natural organization, in general, as always, you go most important to least important. We're not going to do this exercise, but this is something, again, after you write what you're going to do with your $1 million I gave you at 8:15 this morning. This would be another thing you can do. Write 10 sentences or 9, whatever, with these sentences. The project is significant because, it's original because, it's innovative because, will that go in the innovation? Our research team is uniquely qualified to do this work because. So back in 2008, when I first gave the 4-hour version of this seminar at Emory, we did this exercise, and someone in my table over here, she says, "Oh, yeah, really can. You know, that's beating the drum too hard, saying, you know, we're the best to do this." And what's my response to that? Not only can you do that, but you're best advised to do that. Okay. You heard earlier how I go to Einstein every year. That's the place I've been giving talks since 1993. So it feels like home. It is, I'm from New York, so you can probably tell that already. But one of the, there's master's degree students. These are like physicians and dentists who are doing a master's degree. One of them said that his mentor told him that in your submissions to journals, you be more conservative, and in your grant applications, you be more bold, right? Make sure you have the scientific rigor, but you have to be more bold. Okay, again, that's another thing you can do as a follow-up exercise in your writing. Now we move into using the reviewer critique criteria to inform your writing. I was explaining to my oldest daughter back when she was in 6th grade. She's a couple of years out of college now. This is a while back. And I was saying, you can use the criteria people are asked to judge you by as a means to inform your writing. And she goes to me, "Oh, you mean sentence starters, Dad?" Yeah, sentence starters. So we are literally going to mine criteria for phrases that the reviewers are asked to consider and use them to start our sentences, at least in our early drafts. So here are the criteria for the significance section. And there's the link, you can go to it. It's actually the same link for all the criteria that we're going to go through in these other 3 sections. And it's divided by the type of mechanisms. So, you know, search around, maybe there's criteria specific to the mechanism you're applying for. But the idea is we look at these questions and we essentially answer the questions in our grant application. That it's again, we're creating the environment for the reviewer to copy a couple sentences from your proposal and paste them into that critique template. Actually, you can find a critique template. Basically, it's a blank page and it has all those different categories. And next to each of the categories has a link to that link right there. And this strategy applies to other, again, opportunities. So find the other criteria at the other places, do the same thing. The next section, again, is the innovation section. It's, as you saw earlier, why it's original, why it's innovative. If you don't know why it's original, why it's innovative, you know, work with your mentor on this, work with your colleagues on this. Here are the questions the reviewers are asked to consider for the innovation section. If we just pull out 3 words, let's call them the novel theoretical concepts. That becomes, in your proposal, the novel theoretical concepts in this application include A, B, C. I know one department chair who divides his innovation section into 2 areas: theoretical innovations, practical innovations. And I worked with someone yesterday afternoon, and we found just by looking at her 1-page long innovation section, which we wanted to get down to half a page, we found that she had 3 different types of innovation sentences, 3 different areas that her work was innovative, and that became separate subheadings under this larger section of innovation. Now we move to the approach section. So if we're talking about a 6-page research strategy, let's say we have a page and a half of significance, a half-page innovation. I like to start the approach section on the very top of the 3rd page of the research strategy. Make it nice and neat. So you basically are telling your methods. You want to do it clearly so the reviewer can understand, so they can see the different connections between the different parts of the research, and it gives them a framework for the details that are going to follow in that section. And as I mentioned, most people organize it around the specific aims. Sometimes you have methods that are similar to all the aims, and then in that case, people start with the general method section, and then they organize it around aims. And in other cases, similar, they start with each of the aims, and then they have a general method section at the end. But the idea is you want to make it as clear as possible for the reviewer to understand. Specific aims are not phases, right? They're not time-based things. They're more theoretical-based things. So there's the instruction by the NIH that your aims should be related but not interdependent, right? Related but not interdependent. This was described by me, by Professor Paul, I forget his last name, but I remember his first one. By this example, he says, if aim 1 is to create a mouse model, and aim 2 is to use that mouse model to do X, Y, Z, but aim 1 fails, then aim 2 cannot possibly succeed, right? So you want to kind of approach it from different directions. And in fact, it was that related but not interdependent guideline that informed my little graphic I'll show you soon with the different arrows pointing to the same central objective. So related, they're all pointing to the same place, but not interdependent, coming from different areas. And in fact, my superstar back at Iowa, the guy who put the call out in the text, he also had at one point, he had the phrase, these related but not interdependent aims. I mean, you know, it's like so basic, right? But he was reminding the review, he was basically teaching the reviewers how to do their job. But it's perfectly valid. And he got funded. I don't know for that one, some other one. He got funded, took a number of tries, number of times. Okay, so here is a suggested organization for the format for each of your aims in the approach section. This I get verbatim from that article published by George Eves in Grants magazine back in 1984. Okay, and very interesting. I talked about weaving of information, repetition of information. Look at 1.1 is review of the relevant literature. That's what you just did a page ago in the significance section. And yet we're going to have a short paragraph on each aim on how the literature justifies specific to that aim. And then you can see the rest of it. I will definitely say that you see 1.3.3 and 1.3.4, you absolutely positively have to have a paragraph about that. I've seen it called potential pitfalls and alternative approaches. I've seen it with these words, difficulties anticipated in alternative approaches. Absolutely have to have that. That phrase absolutely positively comes from a New York street sign, a no parking sign. You absolutely positively no parking. And that's been since the 70s. And then, you know, as you can tell, 1 dot everything, you repeat that exactly for aim 2 and aim 3. Ideally, you can have the same format for each of those aims. You want to tweak this? Fine. You know, the NIH is not so prescriptive on how you had to put together the grant application. It's not like filling out a wizard, typing into boxes. They want to give you some leeway. Matt Rizzo, the PI of the Great Plains Idea CTR, he puts his preliminary studies in not the significance section, but actually in the approach section. It's all fair, right? But again, as much as you can satisfy reviewer expectations, do so. Here are the reviewer criteria for the approach section, again, these questions can help you with sentence starters or with making sure that you address these issues. Again, as far as investigators go, people will look into your bio sketch, and we'll talk about that a little bit here in a minute. But there's really no investigator section in the research strategy or specific aims. So your goal would be to have a sentence or two scattered throughout, maybe the aims, maybe the significance about this, in addition to your bio sketch. Similarly, for the environment, there's a separate section called resources and environment. Again, no page limits. You can put a lot of boilerplate that you'll download from the grants office here, or copy and paste on the website. But likewise, you want to have a sentence or two in the aims, in the significance, that addresses how the environment is well suited for this work. And here's a slide I talked about this topic about rigor and reproducibility. And it applies to both assessing the previous research and the research you propose. It may be that the landmark article in the field so far has got some problems with it, right? And if your proposal is going to address filling in the gaps of knowledge that comes from that beforehand, it's your job to address that significance and address it and how you plan to approach that in the methods and the approach. This is another part of that awesome article by George Eves. I read this article probably 1994, 95. My computer at Miles Labs New Haven didn't have internet access. Internet access was just a thing for scientists back then. So at the time, I had to set up a regular library search, and I got an interoffice envelope with that, about half-inch of stack of articles every week. So it's a great article, and these are questions that you can consider in looking at your draft. Make sure that you've answered them or you've addressed them in your proposal. And then we've talked over and over again today about the importance of figures and legends. They explain ideas. And again, in your legend, what it is and why it's important. And even better, what it is, why it's important, and then see section 3.4.3. Right? Send them right to that aim where you plan to address that issue. Again, think about graphics as if your readers are only going to look at the graphics and nothing else. Will they get the overall concept and some details of what you're going to do? Figures are not just for overall concepts. They can be a snapshot of data as well, just to give a taste of what you're doing. So for example, Dr. Rizzo, PI of the IDEA CTR, Great Plains IDEA CTR, I keep talking about him because he's my buddy, and he kindly gave us the example we're going to look at. You can imagine it's very difficult to get examples of grants that I can use in seminars like this. People are pretty possessive about the grant application. That said, you can talk to your mentor, you can talk to your research office, you can go to that link and see a couple of examples. But your job is to get a couple of examples of grants to look, see what works, and apply, format it to your proposal. Okay. And then, so types of tables and graphs for different sections. In the aims page, I talked about that. Maybe you put it there, maybe not. You might not want to caution, so put it at the top of the significance. But in the significance, so conceptual models, we talked about literature review summarized in the table, and images. So back to Dr. Rizzo. In his application, we'll see example in an hour, less. He has two figures that are not overviews of the whole research, in summaries of data, but they are literally a snapshot of 1/30th of 1 second of the data that they're recording. And he researches decision-making by looking at driving habits, right? And so we're going to see, 1 frame of video, 1/30th of 1 second, and all the data that they capture from that, just as a taste of what the the research assistant's going to be doing in the lab when they analyze this data. And then as far as the approach section, by all means, come up with a graphic that is a flow diagram, right? That shows the steps you're going to take. Now, this is from a tutorial at the NIH, and NIH.gov, huge resources. Click around, find these tutorials and other things I'll show you later on. But this was pretty interesting. It taught me something, and that is that your proposals are not judged against each other, but they're judged against the ideal standard. And they use the example, so this is an analogy. They use the example how this is the same way they judge dogs at a dog show. I didn't know this about the dog show, and I didn't know this about grants either. And I read this text. I mean, I'm an English major. I can understand writing, but it really didn't fully gel in my head until I looked at the little graphic of the doggies up there. And notice in the graphic, the text in the graphic is basically the same text that's in the body text here. So that's really interesting. That's nice to know. That said, the first thing a study section does is decide, okay, let's cut this pile in half. Which half are we going to spend 20 minutes each on, and which half we're going to triage out? So this might be true and nice, but it's also true that review panels decide which half they have time to discuss, which don't. So even though it's nice, it's true, it's also not true. Here's what I've been leading up to. I thought I was such a genius. I came up with this. I just did this on Microsoft Word with the arrows and text boxes. And this comes from a grant that got a perfect score, program project grant. Dr. Jack Widnes, faculty emeritus, Iowa. He had 5 projects in this proposal. So we have 5 of these appeared. And he added this broad goal up on top. That wasn't part of my idea. But you can see the idea is that each of those aims points to in his case, he used central hypothesis. I use project objective. It's not new information. The text has already appeared on that page already, or if you put this into the significance, the text has appeared on the page before. It's simply a graphic to reinforce the idea, the information. And Dr. Rizzo showed me on his computer 2 years ago, maybe last year, a super cool graphic. It had a guy with not a chainsaw, a jackhammer. He's going to dig down, and the aims were down there, and all the little methods were scattered in the gravel around. I mean, it was like interesting to look at, not just arrows. So yesterday I was working with one of the faculty at UNO, and she had a kind of a graphic like that, more of a conceptual model. And my advice was, can you find a little image to put in there too? Because graphics ideally are graphical, not just arrows and words. So, oh boy, I'm not a content person, but thrombocytopenia neonates. I don't know, little premature baby in one of those little boxes they live in, just to give it a little taste of what's going on. They do live in it. But it's clear. Okay. So of course, conceptual models like this, right? I just found one. I searched. So you can search medical images. And so this is just an example of what these look like, but you know what these are like. This, I think, would be appropriate more for your significance section. And what I've seen people do, and I caution you about this because it tends to get a little messy, but sometimes I see people combine a conceptual model and have a little box that identifies aim 1, 2, and 3 in it, right? Again, the danger there is you might confuse people. But if you make it clear and simple, that's a potential to do that. And that would be top right of your significance section. We'll see the exact example from Dr. Rizzo's, one of his many proposals in a bit. But here's a table that talks about hypothesis testing. The same hypotheses listed in the table have appeared on page 1 of the aims, right? Page. And if I were a reviewer and I were to 10 pages later, after reading the aims page, come across a table like this, that would give me a lot of confidence that investigator has really thought through their plan and what they expect to get. So Dr. Rizzo says, use it. In fact, anything that's been funded by the US government is available to you, right? You literally can get any proposal that's funded because you own it. Now, sometimes it takes freedom of information lawsuits to get it, right? Sometimes it takes the letter. The last I heard is that if you do request a proposal and the investigator does decide that it's okay and NIH sends it to you, then NIH also sends a letter to that investigator saying they got a copy, right? But it's available. Just like with the NIH report, you can find examples of project descriptions. It's out there for you to see, and you can use it to inform your writing. You absolutely positively must have a timetable. It also gives people, reviewers, a lot of confidence you can carry out the work. For a 5-year grant project, I see most people divide the timetable by 6-month periods. And in the task, certainly aim 1, 2, and 3, but also we'll see in Dr. Rizzo's example, he has study subjects. So number of subjects to be recruited, and there's numbers, 15, 25, 25, 20, 15. Include time, I've got a slide about this later, but include time for training, for preparation of manuscripts, dissemination of the information. So timelines show that you have a clear plan, that you've thought through the project. And here I just mentioned, you can include time to do the other things that aren't just aims. The biosketch, you get 5 pages for the biosketch. There is a instruction form and a template form and a couple of examples to look at nih.gov on the biosketch. So you download that form, it'll tell you when it's good till. Fill it out, it's got your degrees, and then it's got a personal statement section. So increasingly, since 2009, the biosketch includes sentences and paragraphs, narrative. In the personal statement section, it's your personal statement, but the idea is after a paragraph length stuff, after you say what you're all about, what you're interested in, what you've done in the past that qualifies to do this work, then you want to tailor it, especially toward how your experience qualifies to do this specific work. In larger proposals, like program project grants, where they have co-PIs or multiple PIs or co-Is, the last few lines of the personal statement section read, my role in this project is to whatever the role is, right? So you're going to have your main biosketch, and then every time you use it for a different grant opportunity, you're going to tweak it a little bit. Just like you would do your resume and you send it to different types of jobs, you'll tweak it a little bit. I know your postdocs, I talked with postdocs a lot before, and especially most recently at Stowers in Kansas City. I don't know if I'm pointing south or not, but so I met a 13-year postdoc, right? And he had taken a job at McKinsey. McKinsey Quarterly, McKinsey Consulting. Like you make lots and lots of money and you're away for 6 months at a time. And then you use all your Marriott points and have a month in a huge hotel. But I mean, he had put in his time, man, and it was rewarded by it. And I'm like, hey, you're a postdoc in science. You're getting hired by McKinsey? Like their business and your science. What's that has to do? He's like, no. 13-year postdoc, you learn. You're so smart, you can do anything. Now, he's probably doing like the science side of whatever business they're gonna work at, but pretty interesting. Okay, so also in your personal statement section, you can list up the 4 citations. These would be like the top best papers that you've published. But it doesn't have to be just papers. The instructions for the biosketch say educational products. So for instance, this video that they're making, if I wanted to get a copy of it and I wanted to put on my website, and by all means, go to paulcasella.com and look at my poetry TV and my outreach videos in Tanzania and all this great fun stuff I did. But I could call it an educational product. And I can put it on here.
A question.
Please.
So in the personal statement, I've heard like different things about, should it be written as a first person or should it be written as a third person?
Yeah, my opinion is to be first person. I mean, especially the first statement. It's about you. You should talk about yourself as first person. I am a whatever board certified research trained specializing in this area. I've worked under this famous guy for 2 years and this famous person for another 3 years here and here. I mean, don't make this stuff up. It's got to be true, right? But yeah, first person. In fact, the answer to this question, that applies to every part of the grant application. In the research strategy and the specific aims, you probably want to use the we because it is you and your mentors and your lab assistants and colleagues. But in the biosketch, it's going to be I. The other narrative part of the biosketch is these contributions to science section. And you get 5 different half-page length contributions to science. My best advice is to keep them about 1 paragraph long. And there are instructions. So here's your outline, follow. Keep them relatively short because you only get half page each, right? So a paragraph of that, and then you can list up to 5, I think, of the, up to 4 publications of research or research products. So publications, talks, posters, videos. And then we talked a lot about the importance of subheadings. My point is not only have number 1, but give us a 3 or 4 word subheading at the beginning of it. So the intellectual skimmer can skim through that. Now, we're not going to do this, but this is something that if you and your friend or your colleague want to do, it'll be highly informative. You present to them 5 minutes about what you're all about. They take notes. They present to you 5 minutes what they're all about. You take notes, and then you exchange the notes. And it's very eye-opening, the difference between what you thought you said and what they perceived, right? And that will help you revise your biosketch. Like they might point out, hey, I was most impressed by this thing. You thought it was so-so. Well, to emphasize that in your biosketch. We talked at length about the importance of resubmission. It gives a chance for you to show how you responded to the reviewer's comments and you improved the proposal and capitalize on the strengths of the application. The purpose is not to argue with the reviewers. It's not a response to the reviewers. It's an introduction to the resubmission. So we run new faculty orientation 3 times a year at Iowa. We have about 20 or 30 new faculty every third of a year. And for one segment, we do breakout groups. So we have senior professors or department chairs come in, and there's one for the tenure track, one for the research track, one for the clinical track, whatever. So I'm hanging out in the back, ready to give my little 5-minute overview of my services. And I overheard one of the mentors telling what these researchers what to do about their resubmission. He's like, the first draft comes like this. You idiots, you missed this point, you missed that point, and you got it all wrong. And then like, okay, that's first draft. Then you step back and you be more objective. You frame it positive, okay? So let's look at how the format that I suggest. The first few lines essentially read like this. We thank the reviewers for their insightful comments on our original submission, RO1507, whatever, close parentheses. We have revised the proposal based on their suggestions, and it has resulted in a much stronger application. And then sometimes people put a line in like this. Changes we made to the original proposal are highlighted with a line in the margin as seen here. And what I do is I do the little borders and shading thing. I put a little line on the margin like that. And then in the revised main application, similarly, anything you changed, you mark with that revision. I used to see that a lot more in the past, not as much recently, but it does. I mean, way in the past, people used to put in italics everything they changed, and that's just really hard to get through, right? Line in the margins, not nice and neat. So that's going to take up the first 2 or 3 lines of your introduction to resubmission. Question? No? Okay. 2 or 3 lines. And then most of that page, you used to have 3 pages, now you get 1 page, right? Most of that page is going to have 4 or 5 word heading, like the critique, and then you respond, like what you did to change the application in response to that critique, parenthesis, see section 3.4.5, right? Close parenthesis, so you direct them to it. If you get a score and not funded, you get what used to be called the pink sheet, because back then it was carbon copy, it's probably yellow, pink, whatever. It's called a summary statement, right? It includes your abstract, your project description. It includes a section called resume and summary of discussion. That is something that the scientific research administrator has typed up about the discussion that was held, summary of discussion. Then it goes on for 4 or 5 more pages, and it has these specific critiques of reviewer 1, reviewer 2, sometimes there's even a reviewer 3. My whole point is that you do not have enough space in 1 page to address every critique each of those 1, 2, and 3 reviewers did. You should mostly concentrate on that section called resume and summary of discussion. Okay, maybe you pick a few other important ones that the reviewers picked up. So there's only room in that page for, 1 page of stuff. So the critique and what you did to change it. Let's say you don't agree with the main thing the study section said. You don't ignore it, because review panels can have access to that summary statement, next time it gets reviewed. So critique that you don't agree with. We acknowledge this critique. We thought about changing it, but here are the reasons why we can't change it. And we've gone, we've taken this into consideration, and although we can't change it totally, we have accounted for this issue by doing this, that, the other thing, see section 3.4.5. This brings up another issue that I want to bring up now, and I'll repeat later. And that is another essential part of winning grants is networking. Networking with people at the NIH. It means, and it's the last thing you want to do. If you wanted to do this, you would have gone into sales, but it means cold calling, right? Picking up the phone, dialing a number, and asking to speak to the project officer listed at the bottom of that RFA. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Obviously, this is something that I don't have personal experience in. I've just heard in seminars and had some personal experience. I'll tell you 2 stories about this. I heard in a seminar that what you should plan on doing is sending your Ames page at least a month in advance of the submission deadline to the project officer with a quick email saying, attached to my Ames page, I'm hoping you can give me some feedback. I'm planning to submit for the deadline of, October 3rd, whatever it is. Maybe you hear back, maybe you don't. But I've been repeating this suggestion. And here I am again, giving this talk in front of the pediatric fellows at Iowa. And of course, I always have 1 or 2 faculty commentators there. I'm telling them this point, and the commentator raises his hand. He goes, I did that. I did that 3 years ago when you told us when I was a fellow. I did that. The project officer took an interest, solicited 2 independent reviews, that specific Ames page alone, bundled them up and sent them back in enough time to make revisions in advance of that submission deadline. So it might work. Later, we'll talk about videos you can look at, and a nice short one, tips for applicants, something like that, has interviews with project officers. And essentially they say, we're here to help you. Contact us. They are scientists in their own right. You treat them with respect because they can give you insight. But they're there to help you think through the best way to revise or to, way to put your information. That's the first story. Second story, kind of incredible, but it's true because this did happen to me. I mentioned Audrey, the professor in the College of Public Health. She gives a semester-long class on grant writing. So they have a whole semester long and they do all these things. And this guy, Tim, junior faculty, trauma surgeon, is taking this class, very thorough student. He is doing it all. So back in 2008, Iowa City experienced some major flooding, right? The university shut down for 2 weeks. Everything stops. I guess Tim had some work to do, trauma surgeon, but still pretty much shut down. Tim doesn't have much to do. He's in the office. He's done everything for this class except pick up the phone and try to talk to the program officer. And he figures, well, you know, why not? Give it a try. So he calls and he talks to somebody and he gets put on hold, transferred to someone else. Talks to them, gets put on hold, transferred to someone else. Third person picked up, it's the director of the institute he's applying to. And turns out she's from Iowa City. And she wants to know, how's Iowa City doing because of this flooding? Her dad's a professor, her mom's a professor in music, whatever it is. So they chat for 10 minutes or whatever about what's going on in Iowa City. And then, you know where this is going, she says, well, tell me about your project, right? And so we used to talk to the director of the institute about his project. So that I think is kind of amazing. Then I meet with him 3 weeks later, university's opening, and I meet with him and he's telling me about this. And literally at that moment, his computer goes ding, new email from the director of the institute, reminding him, don't forget to send me a copy of your Ames page before you submit. Is Tim going to get the grant just because he talked to the director? No guarantee. But maybe he got some good advice from her. Maybe she directed him to the most appropriate program officer to help him out with the deal. My buddy Chuck, again, my neighbor, cell biologist, he has worked with a number of different project officers over the years, about my age, so he's, you know, tenured and all that. He says some of them really aren't excited about it. Some get excited about it, right? So it's hit or miss. It can't hurt to try. While we're talking about project officers, I'll repeat something that I heard just only last year in Kearney. Give these talks in Kearney too. The head of research there, her name is Kim. And we have a small group, because a smaller group of researchers there. One of the researchers talked about how she actually had a one-on-one live meeting in Bethesda, wherever it was, with a project officer. And her point was that she walked out of that meeting more confused than when she walked in, right? And so Kim, the director of the research at UN Kearney, says, okay, the project officer is not going to tell you what to do, right? But the project officer can help you think through it. So the project officer will help you think through the pros and cons of different approaches you might take in your research. The project officer can't tell you what to do because it's going to go to a separate review panel of academicians, you know, whether it's a webinar or live or whatever. So they can't tell you exactly what to do, but they can help you think through it, pros and cons. So I think that's important to recognize. You're not going to, you know, get all the answers, but they can help you think through it. Please. You got to hold it down. Yeah.
I had a question about the critiques that you were saying. How do you address conflicting critiques? So if you have reviewer 1 and 3, love your project, reviewer 2 kills it.
Right, great question. The short answer is focus on the resume and summary of discussion, okay? Capitalize on the critiques that said they loved it. So let me back up and revise that introduction to the resubmission, first few lines. We thank the reviewers for their thoughtful comments on our proposal. This is what I'm going to add. They thought it was, quote, good use of this, and it's a few of the positives. In addition, they had some helpful comments on how to improve the project, okay? So the ones, you highlight the positives, those are the reviewers 1 and 3 love it, and you acknowledge that it can be improved, that reviewer 2. The rest of that page is mostly going to focus on the resume and summary discussion, but you do want to bring up what reviewers said. So this is kind of a judgment call. I would seek help from your mentor on this. In fact, I look back at my life in general, and the main mistake I made up until about last year, so let's call it for the first 56 years of my life, was I did not seek help. And the other main mistake that I made up first 56 years is I did not network enough with people. So bother people, be a bug in the rug. I mean, you know, there's only one way for them to make you go away, and that is to, you know, help you out. And you can always do it nicely and objectively. Now, but your question brings up another issue, and that is, you might submit a grant, not get it, get scored. They say, do this instead. So you revise it. So it reflects to do this instead, gets reviewed, and that review panel says, oh, no, don't do it that way, do it this way, which happens to be the way you first approached it, right? So that's very frustrating. And peer review is not perfect. We acknowledge that. So that, for instance, would be a great reason to call the project officer on that project. Say, I got conflicting reports in this summary. Can we talk about it? Essentially, I'm saying, find a reason to talk to the project officer. I walked into the conference room in radiation oncology about 5 years ago, and one of the faculty was there early. He was sitting there and he says to me, oh, you know, just last week, this RFA came out, and if this word was just this other word in this RFA, my work would be perfect for that. And my first thought was, call the project officer. You know, ask what to do about that, what suggestions they have. That's frustrating. It definitely is frustrating, but it's a reality.
May I say really quickly too, my dissertation advisor, when he was working on his dissertation at Wisconsin, he said that he had a question and he looked up the Harvard directory and just called up Noam Chomsky, the linguist and literary critic, on the phone, and they talked about it for quite a while. And he just reminded me that in his case, he's just some dude sitting in an office, same as you and me, that these are people, they're happy to help. And that's literally what they're there for.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, you know, in these review meetings, I always have to keep reining in the reviewers because they stop asking questions. They start telling people what to do, you know? And I say, hold on, it's like herding cats here, rein you in. Our job is to ask questions and to listen, right? But they're professors, they're faculty, they're teachers. That's what they do. They like to give advice, right? Point is, if you ask someone the right type of favor, they end up owing you. You know what I mean? Because you're asking them something based on their expertise. You know, maybe you preface it, Dr. So-and-so, I really admire your paper and this and that, doing some of the similar work. Can I ask a few questions? Or I used to do talks for the women in vascular surgery. And their advice, as far as networking, because, you know, national meetings, people are very busy. They have friends from all over the country. They set up dinners with people in advance. So their advice was, if there's someone you want to talk to network with, what you got to do is send an email in advance. Say, you know, I'm going to be at the Society of whatever meeting. Can I buy a cup of coffee? Pick your brain. You know, so you got to set that up in advance because you just can't count on bumping into them in the conference center. Thank you, and thank you, Charles. Okay, so yes, that's what I wanted to say about the program officers at NIH. They're there to help you. They say it in that video, and by all means, watch that video. We'll get the link in a second. So we talked about this already, right? The tone. Here's that page with these 6 videos, and I started watching them all, but I found one of them to be more helpful than the others. A lot of them are just like recordings of panelists, but this NIH tip for applicants I thought was especially helpful. And so after watching it for 2 or 3 times, I watched it again and sat at my computer madly typing away. And this is basically the main points that the video makes. And that is, we haven't addressed this. Don't be over ambitious with your proposal. This means that you're not going to get the grant just because the NIH thinks they're getting a deal, right? That you're going to work 16 hours a day or 23 hours a day. They want you to have thought it out well enough to be able to know that you can actually achieve this mission, right? So don't over promise stuff. And the term they use in the critiques is overambitious. So you get a feedback from reviewers or the resume and summary discussion. It says it's an overambitious project. That means your 3 aims might have to turn into 2 aims. We're going to use this as a kind of a summary at this point. Make sure I hit on all these points. Obviously, I didn't talk about number 1. We talked about clarity and repetition of important ideas. We talked about how your project's going to advance science and certainly health. Seek outside feedback. We've been talking about that for the last 10 minutes. Contact them. We've talked about that. Revise and resubmit. Account for feedback and revision. Lucid style. Address the impact. We've been hitting on that feature benefit mode, right? Tell the good story, what, why, and how. It's a little bit more in the humanities there, but you still can figure out the path that led you to propose what you propose, and you trace that line in your significance section. Clarity, again, how it's innovative, we've hit on that. And then nothing makes you a better writer than serving as a reviewer. Anyone serving as a reviewer here? Okay, good. So everyone who didn't raise their hands, your job is to send an email if you feel you're qualified, or ask your mentor to suggest you as a reviewer for maybe your mentor is an associate editor, or maybe he reviews for something, or even say to your mentor, hey, mentor, can I take a first stab at the next review you have to do? Right? So, but if you, like, they don't know you want to volunteer to do this stuff unless you tell them. There's another major lesson I learned. I'm talking about me now because it's wearing my shirt and tie. Major lesson I learned in corporate America is they don't know you want to get promoted unless you tell them, right? So write a letter to the editor, not as a publication, but a letter to the I forget what it's called, the managing editor, and say, attach your resume. I'm looking to become a reviewer. Here are my qualifications. Please consider me, right? Nothing makes you a better a writer than being a reviewer. And there are webinars you can go to. I'll get to that slide in a minute, where they teach you how to be a reviewer. Become a good reviewer, you get to be a better writer and get advice from peers and mentors. So here's what I was thinking about just now. 3 links, 3 areas in which you can learn about how to become a reviewer. One's a webinar, resources. So, you know, this takes time and effort. And maybe if you don't have the spark to write in your log or dictate your ideas, you can do this. Highly encourage that. We're not going to do this, but similar to the BioSketch exercise, this is an emphasis on graphics. And see if you can make a nice little graphical representation of your project. You can share it with somebody and you can see what they think and use that to improve. Now we look at our exercise in deconstructing on the sentence level. We have, again, just to repeat the instructions for the project description, to repeat how we put those instructions to an outline. And what we'll do is look, and then just to emphasize, this is the website that you should play around with for an hour. Absolutely, positively, search your mentor, search your topics, look at what is currently funded in your area to get a sense, not of the content, or that would be interesting, but of the style, the format. Here is the abstract, the whole one that we'll look at. Don't read this, we'll get into detail sentence by sentence. But I was attracted to this one mostly because it's about writing and how it can improve health, right? And Dr. Howard Butcher is a faculty in our College of Nursing in Iowa, and he kindly sent this unsolicited before a grant writing talk to me. And he told me it was indeed funded. So what we're going to do is identify the purpose behind each of these sentences and use it. And you can use this one, even though this is probably not related to the science you're doing. You can use this as a guide, as a model. So we deconstruct this. Our job is to identify what the purpose is behind each of these sentences. And by the way, in your handout, there's a page toward the end where you can fill in the blanks. So the question is, what is going on in this first sentence? What's the purpose of this sentence? What does it do? Not about the science, but what does it do editorially wise? The answer is kind of hard because it's too simple. It's right there. The answer to the question is the first two words of the answer is the first two words of the question. The purpose of the sentence is to tell the purpose of the study, right? And let's just go back. Broad long-term objectives. So purpose of study, objective of the study, kind of the same thing. Okay, so I'll tell you now, it follows that model very closely. So the purpose is to tell the purpose of the study. Okay, good. What else is going on in this project description? What else does it do editorially? Well, we have this parenthesis, this acronym SWE. An acronym is what you say like a word like NASA and SCUBA, and abbreviation is like DNA and RNA, where it's just you say the letters. So it defines the acronym SWE, structured, written, emotional expression, okay? And then what do you hear? What is the second half of the sentence about? Emphasis on health. Exactly, that's it. It's the goal of the public health service to improve the health of Americans. It's not the National Institute of Research, it's the National Institute of Health. Exactly right. It tells the purpose, it defines SWE, it identifies the sub area of how it's related to health. Good. Number two and number three. SWE is an intervention postulated to facilitate. So what does sentence 2 do? It defines SWE. It tells what SWE is, right? We just had 4 words about it, the name of it. Now we know it's an intervention postulated. That's a great word. Postulated sounds really academic, right? Really scientific. We're going to get more of that in sentence 3. It tells what you do. So you write for a little bit about your thoughts and feelings and traumatic experience. Okay, sentence 3. What does sentence 3 do? It's about health. So granted, we get it. Negative consequences, health. What do you hear in the words are well documented in the research literature? Just go on and say. Proof, yeah, it's telling that well documented in research literature. That means there's stuff that's been editorial approved, peer reviewed, proof of this intervention, right? So it's saying that there's a solid scientific basis for this intervention. This goes back to rigor and reproducibility, okay? And then with family caregivers being more stressed, burdened, and depressed than non-caregivers, all right, health. All right, sentence 4. This is a really easy one. What does sentence 4 say? It's the specific aims. Once again, the answer is right there in the question. And it's a long sentence, but they're numbered. And of course, you must number your aims. We talked earlier about how aims should be specific and measurable. How editorially do these aims convey the specificness or measurability? I'll give you a hint. It's kind of like at the top right of the keyboard. It's shift number 9. These parentheses, right? So we get these scales are going to use in each of these areas. Defining meaning through caregiving scale, the burden interview, the CESD, don't know what that is, probably didn't have enough room to write it out. Maybe the reviewers will know it. They'll know it when they get to the paper. And then this is where it gets really interesting to me. The Pennebaker inventory of limbic languidness, so you know how flexible you are, I guess. And salivary cortisol measured QID over 2 days. Buccal swab, right? Cheek swab. Remember we talked about aims being related but not interdependent? Here's an excellent example of that. We're going to do an interview, probably free answers. We're going to do a scale, 1 to 5, 1 to 10. We're going to do whatever the CSD is. We're going to do the Gumby-like flexibility of your limbs, and then we're going to take a cheek swab. Different ways approaching the same objective. And they're going to determine the effect of SWE on, and here it is, health, 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 health. After that very long sentence 4, Dr. Butcher gives the reader a break by giving 2 nice, clean, short sentences. And they are about the methods, right? The approach they plan to take. And in fact, I'm not going to flip back, but if you look back to the instructions, the outline of instructions, you'll notice the bullet point after telling what the aims are is telling how you plan to do it. Caregivers will experience a total of 3 20-minute writing sessions scheduled every day. And typically at the end of method section, clinical studies, it's all outcome measures will be collected at this, and 1 month post-intervention. Okay, long sentence, 2 short ones. Give the reader a break. Variation length of sentences. Sentence 7, what is happening in sentence 7? Again, the answer is right there in the question. The hypothesis, right? So hypothesis, expected outcome, whatever you want to call it, it's there. They hypothesize that this, and it'll be associated with health, 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 health. Sorry, health, health, self-report, cheek swab. Really interesting stuff, I think. I want to point out editorially the control that Dr. Butcher brings to this writing. Here we have in yellow the order of those conditions. Notice they appear in the same order in sentence 7 as they do in sentence 4. That all shows control of the writing, helps the reader understand and remember. So the last sentence here. Of course, one of the main themes of this talk has been the feature benefit model of framing your ideas. We're going to count the benefit statements in this sentence, okay? Given the negative health outcomes in family ADRD caregivers, that's number 1, and easily administered, number 2, and low-cost intervention, number 3, that has an impact on improving health outcomes, that's number 1 again, but just framed positive, but we'll give them credit, is both significant and timely. 6 benefit statements embedded in this last sentence. We're going to see more examples of this in the example we'll look at Dr. Rizzo's grant. But again, it's an abstract project description, perfectly valid to be this bold and straightforward and explicit in the project description, especially here in the last sentence. I just end this little bit with, so I couldn't fall asleep once, so I just thought it'd be a funny way to put it, but I've been talking about sentence starters a lot today, right? And so here you have 33 things that I find myself not being able to get out of my head when I can't go back to sleep, right? And you are absolutely 100% free to use these things in your proposal. In fact, I advise you to. Why? Because I've seen them over and over again. I've written them and I've edited them. Now, as a bonus, so we have some references here. As a bonus, we're not going to go through this one by one, but I've got another 10 slides about the format of a proposal for a nonfiction book. I just thought it was a bonus way to help think about your proposals, but you know what? Maybe you want to write a nonfiction book someday. There is great examples of science writing out there for you to read. And in fact, another great way to become a great writer is to read good writing. One of my one-on-one consultations on Monday included he was just writing his dissertation. So I guess technically he was a student, but he asked me, what are good science writers to write? And so I just Googled good science writing, E.O. Wilson and Carl Sagan. And I mean, there's great science writing. When I first started this career, I read a book, How We Die by Sherwin Newland, Yale surgeon. So I'm going to leave the slides now, and we're going to move into the example that Dr. Rizzo kindly gave me 5 years ago to use in these seminars. And again, I gotta say, it's kind of rare that you get to see this kind of thing unless you solicit it from your mentor. Now, I hope I didn't shut off the whole Zoom. No, we're good. Okay. I need to go to Word. I might need your help, Charles. Okay, it's, I don't know where to put it. I thought it was open in Word. I can put my memory stick in too. Oh, okay. Oh, the last file downward. No, no, no. Open.
Oh, this is my word.
Okay. You put it on the desktop. Oh, yeah, we are. Thanks. Okay.
That's my word again.
Oh.
And I really don't have a numbers coloring book.
Let me just put my memory stick in again. It's your word. Oh, maybe it's this one. Yep. Oh, no. Okay, we're getting there. It took us only 7 minutes to do this yesterday. I know this much. Yeah. Okay, good. Okay, now I've got to share this, right? Do I stop share? Because stop share? No, I share screen. Yeah, great. Okay. I want to make sure that you all out there on Zoom can see the Word file I just opened up. I don't see a green. Well, we'll proceed. And if you can, Charles, just monitor it. And I'm going to ask anyone out there on Zoom, if you can't see this summary, beginning, this would be it's called summary here, but it's a project description. You can see the, okay, great. All right, so of course you all know how to use track changes. And I want to show no markup. Please move this window away from the, all right, good enough. Okay, so this is the project description. What you see in yellow highlights is not part of the final proposal, right? It's just a draft, okay? It's not on your screen. Okay.
I still had the document up until just then.
I know, I just stopped sharing. I'm going to share it again. Okay. Is it on Zoom?
Yes, it is.
Oh, great. Okay, so you can see we've gone through these instructions a number of times already, right? The project description starts with the objective of this research, just like the instructions ask, okay? Quantify, Quantify, that's a nice, strong, measurable word, right? Okay, so we get the objective here. Then we get a little background. This is a key factor in risk, particularly in these people. It may lead to a crash related to health. Getting in a crash is not good for your health, right? Further, other, subsets of why this is important for people's health. We turn then, if you remember our outline, especially the one that was anatomy of a specific aims page, we turn that to a solution. Okay. The problem is this problem of patient safety and public health can be derived through systematic measurements. Here we start the benefit statements. Systematic measurements of patients in real world settings that by combining technology, that sounds like an innovation statement right there, benefits implementation that permits direct assessment of real world driving behavior with continuous glucose monitoring and real-time feedback in at-risk drivers' health with this condition. Number 4 bullet point on the instructions were talk about the aims. There's the aims. Notice the aims, the verbs they use. Quantify. Quantify is a lot better than just to study. But in the aims themselves, it has a lot of specificity, specificness. I don't know if specificity is the right word. Okay, they're going to do that one. They're going to evaluate the relationship between this and driving behavior in this. And now, as you remember, after the aims, they ask, how are you going to do this? To address these aims. Now let's start counting the benefit statements. Multidisciplinary team of experts in, you can read it on your own, diabetes, cognitive science, 5 or 6 7 different types of experts. We're going to assess this, and they're going to tell how they're going to do it. Numbers are being used because this is complex stuff. Long sentence, you got a long sentence, divided up into numbered things toward the end. Now we really hit even more benefit statements. The project benefits, there's the word benefit itself. From our successful research, so why they're particularly qualified to carry out the work, using this and that, okay? Statistical power is enhanced by a longitude crossover design, which relates to this and this and this and this. And then another benefit statement, measuring disease-related this enables us to determine the source of residual impairment in real-world driving behavior in drivers with different levels of glucose control. And here again, toward the end, why it's important. By tackling this in real-world community settings, this study addresses the NIH priority of performing translational research in diabetes, a direct, explicit statement of how the work is in line with the mission of the NIH. And then this I like, the last 2 sentences start at an individual level, and it'll provide data on this and therapies, health, preemptive approach for individual patients with diabetes, health, in line with NIH roadmap. At a more global level, so that's a great little rhetorical device on an individual level, on a more global level, helps the reader understand. This knowledge of, now we can start counting the benefit statements again. Naturalistic driving will help inform research trials and intervention approaches for other drivers at risk safety and further development of clinicians who are called to decide on patients' ability to drive safely. This is not only going to benefit the health of the patients, this is going to help the doctors when they have to decide if a patient can drive safely. Now we get to the aims. We're going to zoom out so you can see the balance of information that appears. We get the top third. That's what we talked about earlier is appearing in the, I'll zoom in a second, in the first couple of paragraphs. The aims are in the middle of the page. And then the bottom page, this followed my model. I've been working with Matt for a decade. The impact statement and the figure. So we'll zoom in now again and look a little more closely. And then we're going to just mostly go quickly through the rest of it to look at the figures and tables and graphs and the fact that there's a subheading on every paragraph. So aims starts with verbatim, I think verbatim or close to verbatim, the first sentence of the project description. Here we're only 33 lines into the narrative of this proposal, and we have one sentence that's been repeated twice. Perfectly fine. So here's the objective of the research. Evidence shows that. We just talked about that, right? Being established in medical literature. They're at increased risk for motor vehicle crash. High hypoglycemia is a key factor in this risk. Health impairs alertness, judgment, decision-making, leading to impairments of behavior, and it might lead to a crash. Further, some people are unaware of it, and they're liable to drive while impaired. So again, health-relatedness. Again, problem, solution. Second paragraph is solution. We propose solutions to patient safety and public health problem. And here we start with the benefit statements again. Systematic measurements of patients' real-world settings. 2, taking advantage of technological advances that allow direct assessment of behavior, with continuous monitoring. I'll call that innovative And real-time feedback, another benefit, we're at 6 or 7 now. 6 or 7 benefits in that second paragraph. The aims, notice they're numbered, they're in bold, and they also include the sub-hypotheses under each of those aims. This already is giving me more confidence as a reviewer, okay? And then we get to the bottom third of the page, the impact paragraph, and you've seen my figure before, Matt improved upon it by putting it with a gray background. Aim 1, 2, and 3, we just saw them in the middle third of the page. Project objective, we saw that at the very beginning of the page. So there's nothing in this figure that hasn't appeared on this page again. Now, again, you don't want the caution, don't put it on this page, put it on top of significance, okay? Graphical representation of the key things reviewers need to know going into the rest of the application. And then our impact paragraph. And in fact, you can tell it was a text box. We had to put it in there because I'm not adept at text wrapping. So if you don't know how to text wrap, then learn how to do it or find a workaround. My workaround was insert a text box. Notice the figure also is inserted figure. And I just want to caution you, insert a figure that Microsoft Word or whatever program you use is probably going to default to a box around the figure. And you have to right click on that box and change the line to no line, because you read articles in the journals, you never see boxes around figures in the journals. They just float in white space. You want your grant applications to appear like the major journals format their stuff in your field. So that's the figure. And then impact is benefit statements. In fact, our design and innovative use of tools, there you have innovation section. Now the reviewer can scrape that out and put it right into the critique sheet on innovation. Allows us to do this. These, the results are essential to improving safe mobility and quality of life, health benefits in the nation's ever-increasing cohort of drivers with disabilities. And then we have at an individual level, at a global level, exact same sentences that appeared in the project description, perfectly appropriate. Now we start going a little bit quicker through this, and we see that every paragraph starts with a subheading. In this second paragraph, the whole first sentence is a topic sentence and put in bold serves as a subheading. So we just go through these. Again, the yellow highlights just is a draft. You wouldn't put a yellow highlight in your grant application. And then we just, all these three, and here, a multidisciplinary team of experts in this. That sounds like a sentence that appeared in the project description already. And every paragraph starts with a bold subheading. First grant ever edited from Matt, probably like 2006 or so. Background and significance was just 5 or 7 paragraphs. And we just started reformatting the first sentence so we could put the first half being the subheading also. Innovation. This is not even a half-page innovation. This is about a third of the page or less, right? Innovation. Approach. So here we are in the middle of the second page of the research strategy. Yep. And we've already gotten through the significance and the innovation. So approach to start in the middle of the second page. And well, that page 2 had no figures on it, but it had 4 or 5 nice bolded subheadings. Here we start getting a figure. And what we did here, you can tell another text box. So ideally, your figures will take up the whole width of the page. And if they don't, then I suggest you put them on the top right of the page or the bottom right of the page to allow the reader always to go to the left margin to start the line. Sometimes you get a figure here, here, and here, and the reader has to read here, and they have a long line over here, then back here, and it gets a little weird for the reader. So try to be really simple about your figures. Again, go to the journal. Most figures you'll notice appear top or bottom of the page. And again, little trick, if you want to try to keep your page as neat as possible, you can put the legend in the text box next to it. Okay, another paragraph with a heading. Here's another figure. Another paragraph, headings. So sometimes the headings are just the topics. Sometimes the headings are the whole sentence. Plenty of flexibility there. What you'll notice in this proposal is that the only things that appear in bold are the ones that appear at the beginning of the paragraph. It gets a little weird for us English teachers when you start putting things in bold in the middle of the paragraph, because I don't know what's important, stuff in the middle or stuff at the top. The end of the paragraph, not as awful, but still a little weird. So my best advice is try to limit your bold subheadings to the very top of the paragraph. Okay, we're moving on again, more and more. And then here is the snapshot in time that I talked about earlier, 1/30 to 1 second. Here's what the driver's seeing. Here's a picture of the driver. She's saying, oh no, I'm going to crash. Here's what's happening from outer space. They can see it. And here's the acceleration speed. Ah, child runs out. There's the kid. Vehicle brakes. Speed goes down. Speed is blue. Okay. And there is a child running out. So this is interesting stuff. Color, figure legends. More paragraphs that start with bold. And then I mentioned he decided to put his preliminary data after the beginning of the approach. You have that flexibility. So they talked about all the stuff they did, and then here's another, oh no, I did this, and his, visible sign of sweating. Okay, so really interesting. It's not the whole data compressed, it's a 30th of a second expanded. Maybe your work will be like that, but there's a potential for that. Figure of the study design. So here's the text about the study design. Here's the figure of the study design. If you're a person who likes figures better, this will probably help understand more easily than the text, but he provides both. That, I would argue, falls in the category of accounting for two different types of readers and reviewers. Okay, this is the only place where the text, goes right across. Now, table 1, it is in 9 points. Okay, so I remember making this table out of, it was probably a whole page of information, and we put it now in the table, we get it into half page, save space. Don't go below 9 points is my best advice. Subjects, inclusion criteria, exclusion criteria, things that you'd expect. Table 2, this demographic and health assessment battery has appeared in multiple of Dr. Rizzo's grants because it applies. And again, 9 point. Table 3, assessment battery, again, more of the same strategy. The yellow, again, is just because it's a draft. You wouldn't do that. And summary of variables, main outcome measures, and here's the table we looked at earlier on my slides, right? Data analysis to be conducted for each hypothesis. Here's the repetition hypotheses. Here, aim, hypothesis, and what they expect to get. Would give me a lot of confidence. I realize it's a clinical study and you probably are doing more like bench science work, but you can use this and adapt it to your work. Comparisons, physical power, expected outcomes and implications. Use that very heading if you like. And timetable. You must have a timetable. And here I mentioned, I said he'd show how many subjects got enrolled. That might not apply to you, but could be how many experiments you plan to do in that time period. Data processing, data analysis, report writing, and so on. And then there's another section you need, and well, you probably won't need that if you're not working with human subjects. And then all the rest of it is all that other stuff, that resources and environment. Look, we're about halfway through the file. And so even images in the resources and environment. Well, so I think if you're something like bench science now, if you're, maybe you got a mouse going through a cage and getting a reward if they figure out something. Picture that. Help the reviewers see what's going on. Okay, so at this point, I want to, okay, screen sharing is shared. That's good. I'm not going to make you wait here 5 whole minutes to hear my summary because we've done a lot of repeating like you will do in your grant application. I, again, would emphasize though, that networking, that modeling and deconstructing the feature benefit model, consistency of format, awareness of, here I am summarizing anyway, awareness of the needs of the funder, whatever the funder is, and a measured approach to the writing process. Thank you and best success.
So first off, we'd like to thank Paul Kassev for coming over from Iowa and I think giving this wonderful presentation. I think as I've said ad nauseum, I'm a humanities person. I think I'm probably more on the writerly side of things, and I've certainly learned an awful lot from his presentation. I hope you take a lot from that as well. I'd like to thank Heather and folks at the Idea Center for making this possible. And I'd also like to thank all of you, both here in the room and on Zoom, for your attention. And I hope you gained an awful lot from this. We have an awful lot of food for that. I know postdocs are always after food. So take the food, take the coffee, just strip this place clean. So thank you so much, everyone.